Happy NISAW, greetings and welcome to day 2 of the 2024 National Invasive Species Awareness Week. My name is Christy Trifone-Millhouse, your NAISMA Executive Director. I want to start today by giving a shout out to our USGS presenters from yesterday. All those who joined us saw firsthand the incredible work being done by these researchers and learned all about new advancements in our field. For those who missed these powerful webinars, you can access them on our NAISMA YouTube next week. Okay, our theme for this year's NISAW event is Protecting North American Biodiversity. NISAW is an international event powered by NAISMA to raise awareness about invasive species, the threat that they pose, and what can be done to prevent their spread. NISAW provides a platform for individuals from local, state, federal, tribal agencies, regional organizations, private industry, and citizens to discuss legislation, policies, resources, and improvements that can be made with elected officials and decision makers. We have quite a week planned for NISAW. Today's presentation will focus on language and sharing best practices for communicating about biological invasions to scientists, stakeholders, and the public. Tomorrow, we will learn about federal priorities for research and management. On Thursday, we'll learn more about risk assessments and how they help us understand species movement and potential in diverse communities. Wrapping up the week, we'll learn about on-the-ground efforts that are helping to enhance biodiversity and habitat quality with a focus on NAISMA's new biodiversity position paper. This is a week not only for learning, but for action. Throughout the week, we will be sharing links with you in an effort to connect you with your U.S. senators and House representative. We want them to hear our collective voice and to learn about the importance of this work and why we need support and funding to continue to press forward. Another call to action is to share NAISMA posts and to use the resources in the NISAW toolkit. Before we jump into the main event, I'd like to take a moment to give thanks and to share more information about NAISMA. Events like this are a big lift, and sponsorship is critical to making every aspect of this event happen. A hearty thank you to our NISAW 2024 sponsors for your generous support. We value your partnership and look forward to celebrating with you this event's success. Now, just a bit about NAISMA. NAISMA is deeply vested in our mission to empower the management of invasive species in North America. We are led by an 18-member board of leading experts and professionals, with supporting committees, a strong NAISMA team, and a membership that continues to grow by the day. We encourage you to become involved. We have positions on board open, committees. We want you to be active members. So please, if you're interested, reach out. Our core programming is designed to provide our community with the connections needed to learn about advancements in the field, to share lessons learned. We also provide a collective voice for our community through events like NISAW. Lastly, we aim to provide the tools such as professional development, international standards, campaigns, and the NAISMA Certified Weed-Free Products Program to broaden our impact and to help further our mission. If you're not currently a member, join today. I strongly encourage you to join us. A membership investment helps us to continue to do our critical work as a 501c3. As you can see, there's many options to consider. Again, please reach out if you have any questions. All right, now for the main event. I would like to introduce our workshop leads and one of our NISAW sponsors, Tim Campbell with the Wisconsin Sea Grant and Al Lower with Michigan Sea Grant, both joining us in the room in DC right now. Let's begin the workshop.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Christy and the NAISMA crew for helping us out. We are all excited to be here in DC to talk to you all about invasive species language and naming conventions. I guess what I wanted to do was kind of kick things off a little bit and just share a little bit as to why we're here before I hand things over to Elle to get us started. The funding for this workshop was provided by the National Sea Grant Office through our special meetings and workshop grant program that helps Sea Grant pull together meetings and workshops on topics of interest to both Sea Grant and partners. So thank you, Sea Grant, for helping us put this on. And I think I'd like to start with just a short story on how I kind of ended up in some of this work. I think in 2015, I was working with one of our social scientists at UW-Madison, Dr. Brett Shaw, who I work with a lot. And we were talking to somebody at the Center for Limnology, and they challenged us to make a video about a really complex invasive species topic. And we thought that was spiny water fleas. So we made this admittedly pretty weird spiny water flea video that spoofed on Patton and Zoolander, and we had a lot of fun making it. There was a lot of communication theory kind of tied into it, and we think it worked pretty well with our target audience. But through talking to other people that saw the video, we realized that some of our message framing, the militaristic images that were in there, they weren't having the impact that we thought they would on all of the different people consuming our media. So that really got me thinking more critically about how we talk about invasive species, how we portray them, and how we're motivating people to take action, which has helped me make connections to a lot of great people within the Sea Grant network and nationally thinking about these issues. And I'm very grateful that I've connected with them, and I've really been learning a lot from them on how we can do better in this space. And I think the next 4 hours, I think will really set the stage for us and be some information sharing to get us up to speed on research so we understand the impacts of our language and naming conventions, as well as what people are doing right now to help us be better. And then tomorrow, the people in room will be working to synthesize some of that information and develop kind of recommendations and guidelines, prioritized kind of list of research and future work, since it sounds like there's a lot of interest within our communities and trying to better implement what we know in this space. So I look forward to sharing this afternoon with you all, or morning, depending on where you are. And at that, I'm going to hand things over to Elle Lower. And Elle is the Blancis Communication Specialist with Michigan Sea Grant. They work with the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System and specialize in outreach and communication about aquatic invasive species.
Hello, I have taken over from Tim. My name is Elle Lower. My pronouns are they, them. And as he said, I am the Blancis Communication Specialist. Usually I am based out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. I work with Michigan Sea Grant. And I am so delighted to be here in Washington, D.C. with a small handful of people and with a lot of you guys virtually online. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. All right, everyone, let's talk about Cliff Notes on Inclusive Language in Invasion Biology and beyond. So we are at the Invasive Species Language Workshop. And as Tim said, we've got a full afternoon of talks planned today, as well as a workshop tomorrow to actually sit down and talk some of this out and hopefully develop some guidelines for folks. This presentation is just intended to be a brief introduction to orient you to some of the issues around language that we have been working with in invasion biology. Everything from changing species common names to developing new metaphors that we use in science communication. My friends and colleagues here will be going much more in depth throughout the afternoon. So, first of all, why are we here? Well, I can't answer that question in like a cosmic sense, but we are hosting this workshop in response to ongoing questions about the words we use to talk about invasive species in general. Now, I specifically work with aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes Basin through GLANCIS, which is the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System. Quite a mouthful, keeps us busy. It's a big cross-taxa database that covers everything from invasive fish to plants to microorganisms. It turns out that communicating about invasive species can be especially complex as a topic, and it can also be very loaded. The more I've talked about with other science communicators and invasive species experts, the more I realized that we'd all encountered some kind of troubling language and narratives embedded in our field, from anti-immigrant sentiment and invasive species education campaigns to actual racial slurs in the common names of some species of concern. Now, luckily, there's increasing interest in the role of language use in inclusive science. From renaming species through the Entomological Society of America's Better Common Names Project to professional societies challenging terms laden with negative values like rough fish that can cause unintended ecological harm, it's been incredibly cool and encouraging to actually get some rhetoric taken seriously as part of how environmental science gets done. So today, during National Invasive Species Awareness Week, we're coming together to talk about, well, how we talk about invasive species. Today's presentations will range from species naming conventions and how they get changed to the specific vocabulary and metaphors we use to discuss our work more effectively. Let's get started. So some of our talks today will focus on species names, their historical legacies, and their current utility, and how and when to change them. Species naming conventions, like many other aspects of the scientific process, might seem value neutral on the surface, but they're ultimately a reflection of society. There's three major issues that are currently being discussed around species naming conventions. The first is identifying and changing culturally insensitive names. And the second is the issue of place-based names and whether or not there are better alternatives. And the third is what to do about species named for historical figures with troubled or harmful legacies. So just a brief overview of this. And again, my friends and colleagues will be diving into this much more throughout the day. But let's just take a brief overview here. So culturally insensitive names are unfortunately a lot more common than some people realize. I'd like to draw your attention to the bug at the top of the screen there, the moth and the caterpillar. That is the recently renamed spongy moth, or Lymantria dispar, which is a renaming success story that we'll be learning a little bit more from fellow participants about. So changing controversial common names can take a lot of interagency discussion and a lot of paperwork, but it's also a unique opportunity to raise awareness about a species. And if it's invasive, as in the case of the spongy moth, a new name can even be a valuable identification for the public. Many other species derive their scientific and common names from the geographic location from which they originate. This seems pretty innocuous at first, but it can actually wind up with a lot of cultural baggage, particularly when the species in question is invasive in another part of the world. One of the examples of this phenomenon is personal to me as a Great Lakes researcher, and that is of invasive carp, also known as Asian carp. Many people don't know that Asian carp are actually 4 separate species of fish, all with different life histories and impacts on the environment. Referring to this group of species as Asian carp isn't actually a very useful descriptor, at least in my opinion, considering that common carp, which is another introduced species, are also native to Eurasia, and it just creates unnecessary confusion. Unfortunately, the way that many people talk about these fish, including, unfortunately, some environmental managers, can reflect some very unfortunate sentiments, particularly in light of the wave of anti-Asian hate crime that we've seen since the start of the pandemic. For this reason, there's been a push to refer to these 4 fish as invasive carp or simply by their own species names, categorizing them by behavior rather than their point of origin in order to avoid some of this invective. With many common names of invasive species being place-based in origin, everything from Japanese knotweed to Russian olive to African land snails, this is definitely a topic worthy of further discussion. And so then the third point is, in addition to naming species after their geographic origin, there's another sticky subject when species have historically been named after figures with complex or troubled legacies, such as Confederate generals or other folks who we may not want to recognize as heroes in their field. This is an active discussion going on in several different professional societies, including the American Ornithological Society, who as of November of last year are making a push to rename birds entirely that are named after people. And we'll learn a little bit more about that later as well. So in this week's workshop, we are hoping to develop some guidance for changing species names when necessary, talk about how to get buy-in from researchers, scientific agencies, and other stakeholder groups, and develop a set of best practices for more inclusive language in the future. It promises to be a very interesting discussion. So, in addition to the names we use to refer to invasive species, the overarching metaphors and language we use to talk about them can dramatically influence the way we relate to them as well. Before we start picking apart any specific metaphors we use in invasion biology, we should talk about why metaphors are important in the first place. And I'm so sorry if you haven't discussed this since 12th grade English, but we're going to talk about it this week. So metaphors, why are they important? They are an essential and embedded part of how we talk about and conduct scientific research. We use analogies to develop hypotheses and interpret experimental results, and use metaphors to communicate our findings. Even some of the most fundamental scientific concepts, the cell, which is named after the rooms of medieval monks, the food chain, or agents of infectious disease, these are all based in figurative language. Metaphors basically act as cultural messengers, carrying concepts back and forth between biology and society in ways that may reinforce them within thought, language, and worldview. Because of this linguistic feedback loop, it's especially important to think about the metaphors we use in science, because in a very real way, they shape the practice of science itself. And invasion biology as a field provides some perfect examples. So let's take a look at military metaphors, which Tim talked about a little bit, and which kind of got all of this going in our minds. They're among some of the most common in invasion biology. In fact, invasion itself is a military term. This language can be really compelling, which is why it's so frequently used. It can also be politically advantageous and help gather bipartisan support for funding invasive species management and control efforts. It's honestly also kind of fun. If you've ever gone out to remove a bunch of invasive plants, such as the garlic mustard that may be coming up around you this time of year, it feels gratifying to imagine yourself in a kind of good versus evil struggle to save native species from the invaders threatening to destroy their habitat. However, there are a number of issues with leaning heavily on military metaphors. First of all, this framing of good versus evil in war assigns moral value and decision-making ability to creatures that don't really have a choice in the matter. They're just doing what they can to survive in a new habitat. Second, war requires two opposing sides, but we as humans are actually deeply entangled with invasive species. Our own patterns of global trade and travel are directly responsible for introducing them into new habitats. They didn't just wander over here unassisted, generally speaking. Invasive species can obviously have harmful effects on the environment and economy, but it's not out of deliberate malice. Leaning into military metaphors tends to let us humans off the hook for the consequences of our actions on the environment. Heavy use of military metaphors can actually damage the morale of environmental scientists and managers. If you're in a war and you're not winning, well, you're losing. Recent research has shown that this framework ultimately leads to higher rates of job dissatisfaction and burnout among environmental managers, which is completely understandable if you feel like you're going to work every day to fight a battle that's impossible to win. So next, let's take a look at nativism, which is another commonly used rhetorical framework. It positions non-indigenous species as this kind of implicit existential threat to the native ones, stirring up instincts to protect our home from destructive outsiders. This table highlights a whole series of nativist rhetoric and headlines and article titles, which, as you can see, are kind of unfortunate. This framework is a bit of a lightning rod. It certainly attracts attention and generates discussion when it's used in science communication and reporting headlines, but it's not necessarily positive at all. Nativist metaphors can come across as xenophobic at best and honestly outright racist. There's a long, ugly history, particularly in North America, of conflating human immigrants with biological invasions. This particular table draws some parallels between invasive species control actions and human immigration regulation through the early 20th century. And set side by side like this, it paints a bit of an unflattering picture. In practice, this nativist rhetoric can actually do more harm than good. People who might otherwise be in support of protecting their local ecosystems from invasive species may instead identify with these species if the language used is too harsh, particularly if they're immigrants themselves or have immigrant friends and loved ones. Even if your intentions are good, it's really easy to see how this can backfire. So if two of our most common metaphors in invasion biology, military and nativist, aren't working so well for us anymore, how do we develop a new framework and better metaphors? We can't just throw things away without adding new ones. So a few years ago, at another workshop on problematic jargon in STEM, hosted by the ARC Network, Virginia Rhodes will be speaking about this later, a bunch of other researchers and myself came up with a three-part framework for assessing the efficacy of these metaphors. And that's aptness, heuristic value, and equitability. Long story short, aptness kind of refers to whether the metaphor has convincing similarity to the scientific phenomenon it's addressing. Basically, is the metaphor accurately describing what's going on? Heuristic value refers to whether the metaphor makes a complex phenomenon easier for a general audience to understand. Like, does it add clarity to communicating? And equitability refers to whether the metaphor challenges or whether it reinforces exclusionary social dynamics. Basically, is it fair to different audiences who might be listening? With this framework in mind, there are lots of alternative metaphors that we might be able to explore for talking about invasive species. A common one already in use is thinking of invasive species as hitchhikers, which underlies a lot of the successful messaging about aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes and beyond. Some other promising metaphors involve focusing on invasive species as ecological bullies, which draws emphasis to their behaviors rather than their national origin, which is especially important when you're working with kids. Another one that I'm particularly fond of is conceptualizing invasive species as an ecological illness, which allows environmental managers to take on the role of healers in the environment rather than fighting those battles that they can't win. Additionally, ecological illness has this additional utility in that it's a lot easier to prevent the invasion of these species than to actually cure it, and that ongoing management can help continue to heal the landscape, even if things can't be entirely resolved. When talking about the use of figurative language in science communication, there's another metaphor that I particularly love. If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. At the end of the day, the more inclusive language and more diverse metaphors we have in our rhetorical toolkit, the better we can tailor our messages to different audiences, which is increasingly important in a diverse world. So stay tuned for some of our other presentations to dive deeper into this subject. If you'd like to read more about these topics, check out the QR code here. It links to a reading list hosted by Michigan Sea Grant on the rhetoric of invasion. It's got papers, it's got websites, it's got all kinds of resources that you can check out. And feel free to drop me a line if you'd like to connect further about any of these topics you learned about today. And please don't worry if you can't stick around for all the presentations this afternoon. I know we've got a lot. Our partners at NAISMA will be posting these presentations on YouTube soon. And with that, it's time for me to pass the mic and keep this conversation going. Thank you so much for tuning in.
So I'll hand things over to Sam Chan, who is an invasive species specialist with Oregon Sea Grant, and he and colleagues over on the West Coast have been doing a lot of kind of research and information gathering on paths to more effective aquatic invasive species common names. So Sam.
Thank you very much to NAISMA and to Elle and Tim and to all of you as part of this larger community of us working through this. How do we actually have more effective names to address invasive species? So today I'm going to be sharing with you a presentation on a project that we started a little bit over 2 years ago when one of our very respected colleagues in the aquatic invasive species arena family faced immense difficulty because of naming. In this case, it was Asian names that actually was really connected with the pandemic. And it got us to thinking about what Elle had described as the metaphor invasive species. And when we looked deeper in it, it became very obvious that in our work, that some of the species that we work with, invasive species, tend to have names that have place-based, religious-based, culturally based, lifestyle-based names. And so what we wanted to do is that how prevalent is that? So I'll start off with a background that talks about this topic of common names as they relate to invasive species and how that might actually, in some cases, divert from our main intent to the reality that instead of steering the public and our policymakers into thinking about the impacts of invasive species and what we can do to help prevent their spread and also to work in managing them, sometimes that hate messaging is directed towards people, which is really not really what our intent is. That's really not our energy should be going into. And here just a collection of posters and covers that I reviewed in a very, very quick search, and the abundance of material out there are pervasive in terms of the type of materials out there that don't necessarily get to our main point, like wanted dead or alive, Chinese mitten crabs, angry Asian murder hornets, one fish, two fish, red fish, and then, Jewfish. So when we think about invasive species, in reality, names are really meant for us in the scientific and management communities, in ecological and in ecology and invasive species, to connect with our general public so that we can communicate about what we're working with, the types of organisms. But unfortunately, in some cases, invasive species with common names that specify country, places of religion, lifestyles can have unintended consequences. Instead of focusing on the invasive species and what we can do in their prevention, we end up leading to thinking about, well, to blame, to hate. Why is it that these cultures or these people have introduced these species to my things that I value in our lands? And so something like, for example, Apis mellifera, the African honeybee, soon became the Africanized honeybee, and then the Africanized, and then the killer bee, and then the African killer bee. But what is it when you look at that bee? It reminds us that it's African. Same thing with the Vespa manarina, the giant northern hornet. Why is it? It was in some ways to describe the metaphor that this is of great concern. Some of our very own professionals would call it a murder hornet because of the behaviors with the European honeybees. But then it became, well, it's Asian. Where'd it come from? Asian. Oh, it's the Asian murder hornet. But the good thing is that there is a movement within the professional world, which you'll hear about later from the societies like Entomological Society, that looks into these names and have really done the really hard and sometimes very difficult work of changing names so that we can actually be a more effective scientific society. I'm going to pass over this, which is a really important statement made by the president of the Entomological Society of America, because you hear about more later, but this goes very much in that when it comes to common names, it's about communicating within our disciplines with the public. And when you have names that direct that away from the main emphasis to people and their cultures, that's really not our intent. And that's also not effective. But I will actually be sharing, because as part of this larger group that you saw earlier, we started really looking at databases. So in our invasive species databases, what proportions of names, common names, really have names that associate with a country, a place, a religion, a culture, a lifestyle. And it was very surprising because I had assumed that the proportion would be quite high. But the reality is that when we start looking at two of the larger databases, like the USDA National Invasive Species or NISC database, only about 15% of all the common names of the invasive species, over 1,500, have names that have a place, a country, a nationality, a specific culture, a religion. And so it's a very, very small percentage. And why is it there's that 15%, but the other 85% do not have these names? I think that's something really important for us to think about, because oftentimes people say, well, an invasive species with a name is really important because I know that it's not from here. It helps me learn from that. But why are we only associating that with 15% of these species, not the other 85%, for example? And most of them, these names, if we think about place-based, tend to be associated with Asia first, then Europe, North America, Africa, South America, and onwards. So looking at another U.S. large database, which is the USGA Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species database, about 22% of that database has common names that actually have these cultural or place-based references, but almost 80% do not. So the majorities do not. And I think that's very important when we start thinking about management, where only a minority of these species do have a name that could be problematic, and the majority do not. And so we thought, well, probably because it's all based on scientific names, right? So our colleague Kat de Rivera started looking more carefully into the association between a species scientific name, that's an invasive species, a scientific name, with their common name. And what Kat found out was that less than 30%, 26% of the species had a common name that was associated with a scientific name that was place-based. So again, it's a very, very small element of it. So remember, that's 26% of about 20%. So even a smaller association really had a common name associated with a scientific name. And so I think that's a very important finding. So the scientific name was not the main driver for a common name. And again, we found out that the majority of these scientific names tended to come from three primary continents: Asia, Europe, and the Australia and New Zealand, followed by Africa. And in some cases, when we actually have names that are associated with a culture, for example, or a country, like for example, in the Pacific Northwest, there is the red rock crab, which is really native to estuaries of the Western North America. It's been misnamed the Japanese crab, mainly because of its color, Japanese red rock crab. It looks different, supposedly, from some of our other native crab. But the reality is this is certainly a very native crab to the Western US, specifically the Pacific Northwest. But however, for many decades, it was called a Japanese crab. And it was one of those species that if you see it, you don't want it because it competes with our commercially very valuable, the Dungeness crab. And so again, but this is a misnomer. This crab really has no origin at all to Japan. And then there's this situation with the European bladder snail. And this was called the European bladder snail, but through extensive DNA studies, it was learned that the European bladder snail is actually native to the United States, North America. And so the fact that this species was actually named first in France, it gained the origin that it was a European bladder snail again. So having a name that associated with a country may be inaccurate. And in some cases, it could lead to problems like the early example with the red rock crabs. And then the thing is that names of organisms and changing their names is not woke. For example, as even in the early 1990s, the American Fisheries Society recognized that there were some names that were just problematic. For example, the Jewfish was renamed to the Goliath grouper. The northern squawfish was renamed to the northern pike minnow. So we're talking about actions that happened well over 30 years ago. And so this is not just a passing thing. This is something that's been inherent in our scientific cultures. And again, we're going to hear more about the entomological species, but sometimes when we rename, because organisms tend to have taxa that are in fairly large groups, if we rename one member of that species and we don't name other associated species, we end up with problems. For example, Lamantria dispar, the gypsy moth was renamed the spongy moth, but then there were the Asian variants of it, and we kept the Asian gypsy moth, and then it became the Asian spongy moth. So we kind of fixed half the problem, but we proliferated the other half. And then finally, it was changed to the flighted moth complex. And we'll hear more about that later, but the main reason I cited the example is that changing names is a complex process. It has to be a very engaged process for that to be effective. If we don't do it well and we end up with partial name changes, we could actually create more confusion and really move away to more effective names. So as I begin to conclude my presentation, I just want to share with you two case studies. One case study is the European green crab, or Carcinus manus. It's a species that has been common in the eastern seaboard of the US for several centuries. And in just the past 3+ decades, it's become increasingly a problem here on in the West Coast. But when you look at this crab, what's European about it just by its appearance? It's hard to tell what's European. And we also called it the green crab, but is it really always green? Sometimes it's olive, it's brown, it's dark, sometimes it's orange. But there are some characteristics with this crab that are very evident to help people identify, because we don't want fishermen and crabbers to be catching native crabs and assuming them to be invasive because they look green, for example. And in this case, this crab, if you look up at the carapace by its eyes, on each side of the eyes are actually 5 spines. So creating a name that actually has attributes of that species to help the public in identification helps a lot more than a name, for example, the European green crab. The problem is that the name European green crab is sometimes, as Elle mentioned earlier, is used because it identified as something that's foreign. And at the same time, these became codified in statute in many states and provinces. And many of the invasive species managers are already overburdened as they are already. And to effect a name change would mean that they would actually have to divert time to effecting that name change. And so finally, I'm going to conclude with sharing that when it comes to green crab, the public really catches on to terms. For example, this is a Facebook page with about 5,000+ followers in Oregon. It's called the Oregon Coastal Crabbing and Shellfish. And this group of recreation of shellfish and crabbing enthusiasts are observing and noticing a lot more of the green crabs being caught in their catches. And I actually joined this Facebook group as an education piece, and I've been calling it the invasive green crab. And lo and behold, this 5,000+ group community, they're calling it the green crab. They don't need to have it called the European green crab. So finally, I know that time is short, but you can see the various posts that are being shared. Some are sharing that you can make whiskey out of it from these crabs. And so finally, I want to share that in reality, our work is focused on future generations, and a group of students in Kat Durera's class that I actually co-mentored did a study amongst their peers about language and connotations associated with militaristic language and then place-based or cultural names or invasive species. And so they did a survey amongst their peers. It's not a large sample size, it's a pilot, 78 students. But of these 78 students in a diverse discipline of majors, over half of them, or 56%, either agreed or strongly agreed that the combined use of militaristic language and place-based names for communicating invasive species gives a negative view. And when you actually have a younger generation who are going to be our future policymakers say that, I think that's really critical. They also gave examples in their survey of pictures of, in this case, Asian clam or corbicula, and questions were asked, can you identify this species by name? And only 24% said yes. Do you think that the term Asian clam might have unintended connotation towards people? And almost 2/3 of them said yes. And so they proposed the name gold clam. Would this be easier to help in your identification? And the answer was yes. So these students are going to be very, very important for our future, because for them to take leadership in learning what their peers think is very important. So I will conclude because time is short, but the key point is that it's important for our profession and also as scientists that we think about names that really better engage with our publics we serve so that they can focus on prevention, detection, and management. So thank you for your time.
So we are pleased to have Dr. Erin Cadwalder with us, and she is the Director of Strategic Leadership and Policy for the Entomological Society of America, or the ESA. She leads ESA's science policy and advocacy, as well as the Society's leadership development and programming. Erin.
Thank you. Great, thank you very much. Thank you to NAISMA and to Tim and Elle for inviting us to be here today. Before I start, I just want to explain that I'm here mostly because two of my other colleagues weren't able to attend today. So this work has been done through staff headquarters at the Entomological Society of America by Joe Romaniacki, who's part of our communications team. So he's really the subject matter expert, but if people have questions, I will do my best to answer them, but I will include his email at the end of this presentation. So anybody can reach out to him if you would like to know more. So just a quick overview of where I plan to go with our conversation today. I want to give you a brief overview of just what the Entomological Society of America is, talk a little bit about where the Better Common Names Project came from, what the final process is. As I'm sure you can imagine, this is our first time doing it, so it was kind of a meandering path rather than something that had really clear, clean guidelines, the outcomes and our lessons learned, and then our next steps. And lastly, why does ESA believe this is important? So for those of you unfamiliar with ESA, we are the largest organization in the world serving entomologists and other people that work in related disciplines. We have about 7,000 members comprised of folks from academia, from government, from industry, from museums, the pest management community, all the way down to like amateur beekeepers and other types of hobbyists. We are a nonprofit professional society, and we are headquartered in Annapolis, Maryland. Among the activities that we engage in besides science policy and leadership development, we host an annual conference with about 3,500 insect scientists and related disciplines. And we publish 8 scholarly journals as well as 1 magazine, which is called the American Entomologist. So to start this conversation, ESA maintains a common names of insects database. So there's about 2,000 insects in there, which is not many when you think about the roughly million that we know of and the many that haven't yet been identified. But we use that database to at least try to make it easier for people to understand and study these animals. And so, we have been doing this for quite a while. But when the invasive Vespa mandarinia was identified in 2019, we recognized that we needed to do something because there was no common name that existed at the time. And so in 2020, Asian giant hornet was proposed. But this was also when there was all of the chaos was happening with the pandemic emergence, and folks from Capitol Hill were calling out and reaching out and saying, can you come talk to us about the murder hornets? And it's like, oh, that's a terrible name. Please don't refer to them as that. But, the media was running with it. And so we recognized at the same time, obviously, these larger social changes were occurring from many different perspectives, and the pandemic was just one of them. So as the society has moved towards being as inclusive and creating a big tent for everybody possible, we recognized we needed to do something. So the governing board approved updates to the common names with the intent of discouraging ones that invoked fear or geographic descriptions that were intended to be a slur or anything else. But, there's a lot of names, so where do you even get started? So the Better Common Names Project was established, and the committee included members from ESA's Common Names Committee, our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and several at-large members with relevant expertise and interest in this matter. So Lee Greenwood is going to talk more about the specific process in the following presentation. But the overall process and the process we'll be using moving forward included soliciting community input. So we looked for what names really needed to be changed, what did people think were the highest priorities. To recruit a working group. So we wanted to make sure that we had a good diversity of representation and a lot of different perspectives so that we could hear sort of everybody's thoughts and make sure that we were really capturing the breadth of the community's feelings on these issues. Then we created and submitted proposals. So the groups worked with their communities to research new names, build consensus for the new names, which is a really laborious process. So when people talk about changing names, it's not just, oh yeah, we came up with some new ideas and then slap them on there. There's a lot of time and effort and coalition building that needs to be done around this. And then submit those names for the common names policies, which then leads to another bureaucratic process of reviewing those. And then the proposals went out to the membership and public writ large for 30 days. So after all of that process, then the proposals are adjusted and the final proposals are submitted to the ESA governing board for approval. So some of the outcomes are that we were able to create a rubric for considering how we change names. We used that to draft documentation that helped change the name of Lamantria dispar to spongy moth, which was a huge accomplishment on its own. We were able to provide guidance for the proposed names for the northern giant hornet and two other closely related ones, because as Sam mentioned, when you change one name, you often have to consider the other members of the family and how those names will benefit or hinder future names for the other species. The biggest win was that it led to community adoption, not just ESA using the name, but working with USDA to make sure that we were reflecting the larger family of names with spongy moth that needed to be changed. And if you think about it, USDA, for example, has congressional language that dictates how much money they get, for example, for working on different species. So making changes isn't just changing names so that the media will do it differently. It's like a whole ecosystem of efforts to combat invasive species that has to be considered. As I mentioned, this helped us establish a formal process. And I think overall, this really showed that there's interest in using names that are more inclusive and not, using geographically based ones that don't really tell you anything about the species you're discussing. And lastly, we received an award from the American Society of Association Executives. So a couple of lessons learned. Dropping a name prior to selecting a replacement one creates confusion. So in the future, make sure that's a consideration that you are undertaking, and then make sure to develop a toolkit to help facilitate the transition and make sure you're getting the word out all at once. As I alluded to, regulatory agency collaborators are essential. Some of these very large organizations may be surprised if there's not a top-down, everybody's on board way of sharing this information. So communication is central to everything, but thinking through all the different ways that you're communicating is critical too. One of the upsides is that I think this really provided a professional venue for people and reinforced that ESA needs to be the leader when it comes to changing insect common names. So one of the other benefits is this allowed participants to not be identified as participating in this, whether they don't want to deal with blowback from their communities, even just for tenure considerations. There's a lot of different dimensions to this. Also for people from government agencies, it's easier sometimes to not be recognized as participating just for the sake of making sure that everybody feels like they can be heard in a safe space. And then lastly, it's critical to have many opportunities for input through the committees, through our membership, through the public, and really create an inclusive process to make sure that we're capturing diverse perspectives, that we're reaching far and wide, and that we're building support, as I mentioned, as the process moves along. So for our next steps, just last week, we announced the next 9 species that we will be talking about. And as you're looking at this list, you're thinking, there's kind of a bias here. And I think a lot of that stems from a variety of issues. One being that was kind of a driver in the first place. And you have to recognize that concerns about anti-Asian violence persist. And that is a real concern. You know, again, there's 2,000 names in there, and I don't know if we've done a breakdown of how many of them actually refer to geographic locations, but that's definitely something we'll be looking into because I think that's an important point. So, as we mentioned, there are considerations specifically for changing these common names. And so these are some of the things that went into the creation of that list. So looking at ethnicity, nationality, geographic origin, anything that creates, inadvertent associations between invasive pests and groups of people. Looking for things that have significant public usage. Looking at things that the government has in their regulatory documents. And then which ones are cited most frequently by entomologists and members of the public as problematic. So if you are interested in getting involved, if you scan that QR code, it will take you to our website where you can look for ways that you are interested in participating. So we are looking for members, entomologists, and others who work in this space with a professional role in entomology to provide comments and feedback on the need for new common names. And the comment window closes March 31st. And then we're also looking for volunteers to serve on the working groups to study, evaluate, and propose new common names for these species. And this is like just the next cohort, but it took us quite a while to just change one insectospongine then to get approval for the giant northern hornet. So, be patient. We will have goals for timelines and they will probably shift. So last of all, I just want to say why we think this is important. ESA seeks to be the most inclusive society that we can be for people that are interested in insects and arthropods. And changing the names helps create a sense of welcome and well-being and safety. We believe that it is critical to build as inclusive of a discipline as possible for future generations. The number of challenges continue to grow, and invasive species is a perfect example of that. It's growing every year, and with globalization will continue to do so. And so we really need to bring as much different talent to bear to solve these problems as possible. So with that, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on behalf of ESA today. My email is here. You can find us on our ESA staff web pages. So if you go to NSOC staff, you'll be able to pull us up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee.
Hello, my name is Lee Greenwood. I'm the Nature Conservancy's Forest Pest and Pathogens Program Director, and I'm going to talk to you about one of the most recent case studies of success in naming and best practices, which is the renaming of the spongy moth. Before I get into the renaming process, I'm going to give everybody a very brief overview of the spongy moth itself, because not everyone is an expert on moths. So Lymantria dispara is its scientific name. It is a highly damaging invasive forest pest with a native range of multiple subspecies, and they span most of the forested ecosystems of temperate Eurasia. That's an oversimplification, but it is a very complicated set of different moths from many, many different countries. Its previous English common name is an offensive term. I'll say it once, I'm not going to say it again. We used to call this gypsy moth. And that term refers to the Roma, also known as Romani people. And while people thought that this was a cultural association, one of the colleagues that worked on the project actually was able to dig up some historical data on where that name came from. It's not a cultural association. It's actually an archaic and racist association between the appearance of the moth and the appearance of how people perceived Roma or Romani people. So the origin of the name is actually even more racist than you might have assumed in the first place. So let's go through the process of how we changed it and what the timeline looks like. I think it's important to realize that we all went into this thinking like, wow, big new idea, big change, we'll get it done. And when preparing this timeline, I realized that it's 2024. And I'm going to start this presentation in 2020. So I'd like you all to remember how 2020 felt. It was a while ago. And in the fall of 2020, a number of colleagues, including myself, began a side conversation of sorts through email. And we sort of began a very informal working group of professionals that work in the space of spongy moth to consider what on earth are we going to do to acknowledge the fact that this name is an ethnic slur that we have to use in a professional context day by day. And in that conversation, we identified that actually there was a group that could take a very clear action, and that was the Entomological Society of America, because of the fact that they hold the list of common names for American species. So over the course of that winter, we began preliminary discussions with both the Entomological Society of Canada, because we share both the invasive species and the English language with them, and the Entomological Society of America. And we brought them in a formal fashion and were assigned a staff point of contact, Josh Lancette, who was amazing and has since moved on to different work. So that's why Erin is our top representative today. And we brought them into the discussion and started saying, like, what would we do to change an already approved name? What would the process look like? Who should be involved? And during the course of those conversations, separately, the Entomological Society of America made a decision that the prior name was so notably offensive and inappropriate that it should be removed from the list of approved names. That ended up being a decision that caused additional confusion. But that being what it was, we kept moving forward, and we formed a large Lymantria dispar working group that was through self-nominations as well as professional referrals that incorporated 50 different people from across the US and Canada, as we made sure that we recruited several different folks from Roma and Romani communities and studies, one of which ended up being on our formal working group, who was a professor of Romani studies from Harvard. And then we had lots of other people from federal, state, private entities. We had a language specialist. It was a really interesting group of people. And we did a lot of hard, we were trying to use the Better Common Names Project working process as the ESA was building it. So it was a little bit of that metaphor of you're building the plane as you fly it, which was great because we were piloting this process. We were helping them make sure that it actually made sense on the ground, which was, of course, virtual. And one of the first things that we did was we called for candidate new names, which, being a bunch of mostly scientists, we called de novo names. And we've received over 1,000 different suggestions from the public. Some were silly, some were outright racist and offensive, and some were great. And we recorded over 160 non-unacceptable potential new candidate names. So we didn't record the unacceptable ones. Then additionally, we researched native range names in the local languages all over Eurasia throughout the entire range of Lymantria dispar. We identified over 60 unique names that we translated or transliterated from all the different Eurasian countries that have native populations of Lymantria dispar in them. Now, somebody in the Q&A earlier said, well, why don't we just use the local names? It's a great question, but this really gets to it, which is that there were over 60 unique local names, and it's very difficult to pick which one is right or most appropriate. A number of them did not adhere to best practices as identified by ESA, so we would not have wanted to move forward with those. Some of them were grossly inaccurate. So for instance, referring to a single potential tree that the moth might eat, but this moth eats dozens, if not hundreds of species of trees, so that's inaccurate. And some of them have a shared name with other species, either in North America or in the native range of Eurasia. So it's very non-helpful to have a shared name with another type of moth. So that's why just selecting the local name is a place to start, but it's not the solution for complex species like this one. Then we took that 160 plus 60 more species, and we brought them all together, and we winnowed down to top selections according to best practices, biological accuracy, and a number of other considerations, including literally how long it was, because really, really long names are unwieldy. And we brought it down to about 30. Then we brought that back to a public poll, and we assessed the popularities, pitfalls, blind spots. We had a taxonomic specialist on Lepidoptera, which is both moths and butterflies, make sure that we weren't accidentally including a name that was already another moth or butterfly somewhere else in the world. And we brought it down to 7 finalist names using that process. Then we brought together the working group, and we sat down and we hammered out what on earth we were going to do based on all the polls, all the feedback, all the professional associations, federal counterparts that weighed in with their preferred naming structures and ideas, as well as Canadian counterparts that weighed in with their ideas and feedback and discussion. And it was a really intense process. And then in the ultimate irony, considering what I just completely detailed, we selected spongy moth, which is actually the name of it from the host population in France that was the population that was accidentally seeded into North America in the late 1800s. So after all of that incredibly hard work and due diligence, it's a little ironic to say that we picked the name that was literally just the translation of the name from its native range from the point of introduction. However, we got to that name by an incredibly inclusive and honestly challenging and time-consuming process. It was never our intent to get there. We got there organically, shall we say. Throughout this entire process, many members of the working group kept saying, including myself, wait a minute, we have this regulatory body that we have to pay attention. Wait a minute, there's all these other species that are involved in this species complex besides just Lymantria dispar. After we announced the name spongy moth, an incredible amount of press coverage ensued, most of which was really positive and engaging and interesting, some of which was really insulting and racist and exclusionary. The Entomological Society of America endured a barrage of extremely unpleasant and sometimes disturbing comments and phone calls from what I was told, and I completely believe it because the individuals that had worked on the working group also received some very awkward and unpleasant experiences after the name was initially announced. And I want to be clear that we felt that deeply. It was really unpleasant to go through that process, but it was temporary and it was worth it because we in the working group had signed up to make change, and we knew that some of that change would be difficult, but what we were changing was the insulting of an entire group of people for generations by our own professional work. So I'm very happy to say that was a temporary phenomenon, and I didn't like it, but we moved past it. Okay, we changed the name. So we got that announced in 2022 in January, which was great. At the same time, we knew that there was a related internationally held regulatory terminology that encompassed multi-species of Lymantria moths. And so there were international conversations that were overlapping in 2021 and early 2022 as to how we would rename that regulatory terminology of a group of moths in order to reflect the renaming of spongy moth. That new name was selected and internally confirmed in September 2022 and immediately accepted because they had done a very good international stakeholder inclusion process. And even before it was formally announced at the relevant international body, this is a screenshot from a virtual seminar back in fall. Oh, I mislabeled the slide. I'm sorry. That's screenshot taken fall 2022. The North American Plant Protection Organization, which is NAPO, had already announced that they were going to be changing from the prior name to the new name. So Flighted Spongy Moth Complex is the new name, and they were announcing that right in fall 2022. But we weren't done, because even once the Flighted Spongy Moth Complex was renamed, we had 6 additional Lymantrids, as Sam Chan mentioned, that were also still named in common use using the old moniker. And that was also not acceptable because these are in regulatory documents, they're in outreach documents and so forth. And those 6 closely related species also needed to be renamed to meet best practices. So we had this stepwise progression of different changes that needed to happen. And so we completed them essentially the best we could, one at a time. So we convened another working group of people in the summer of 2022, and we were a lot faster with this one because thank goodness we had put in such a great foundation with the work that had started all the way back essentially in 2021. And we were able to work through it much faster. We were able to gain consensus much quicker with all the different parties. We had gained the trust of the different entities that were involved, that we weren't going to go completely wild with the process and get some crazy names on board. We were going to stick with the most simplest, scientifically valid, easiest to communicate names that we could. And we came up with those, and we announced those actually just last spring. Now you'll notice I have 3 different colors of check mark, and that is so that you can see this really cool little chart that the Entomological Society of America put together because this is such a complicated picture of names. And the initial changing of spongy moth is the green check mark. The additional changing of these 6 related species that had related names, some of which were known by the prior moniker and thus became essentially improved names with spongy moth. Others had been known more as tussock moths, which is another common name for this type of moth. And we maintained that tussock moth naming structure the best we could in order to reflect how the scientific and regulatory community talks about those particular moths. And then that international column is the regulatory complex to make sure that was also included. And you can see that if you imagine this as a Venn diagram, it's kind of an interesting set of interlocking pieces, which is why a chart is really helpful. All of this is really important because we had been identifying closely an ethnic group of people with a context of eradication and government control. And this was a group of people that had an attempted eradication and had been subjected to government persecution. And so it was incredibly unacceptable to maintain this name. And therefore, the challenges that we faced were worth challenging. And I just wanted to point out that this was a particularly egregious name, but in fact, all the geographic names have a problematic element. And so while Erin pointed out that 8 out of 9 of the current names that are on the ESA's list have to do with Asian geographies, all of the different places could be an issue. When you state that one geography might be neutral or perhaps not as bad, that shows your underlying bias. And instead, it's really helpful to say, which ones are the most urgent? Which ones hold the most pressing concern? Not which ones are the most problematic, because they all really deserve to be changed. And I am hopeful, I did not coordinate with the presentations on the bird names, that they will be discussing how you don't just want to change, in the case of the bird names, only the bird names that are deemed to be the problematic people. You want to change them all. So I really appreciate that I was invited to present during this, and Erin and I coordinated our presentations, and we will also coordinate our Q&A according to which of the two of us is the expert on the particular topic of entomology and spongy moth itself. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. There is just a huge round of applause here in the room. So just a reminder to all of our presenters, if you have a chance, if you're logged in and have a chance to check out some of the Q&A, and if you feel comfortable answering any of those, awesome. Otherwise, we'll have a few minutes here coming up where we can tackle some of the highest rated questions. But to round out our session on naming, I'm going to bring up Megan Weber. Megan is an aquatic invasive species extension educator at the University of Minnesota. Her work focuses on creating volunteer participatory science and educational programs that build capacity towards solutions to aquatic invasive species problems.
All right, hello everyone. As Tim mentioned, I'm Megan Weber. I'm an aquatic invasive species extension educator, and I'm sharing work done by my colleagues at the University of Minnesota Extension's Invasive Species Community of Practice. And Angie Gupta, you'll hear from later today, is another who has been highly involved with this process. So first, I'm going to lay some groundwork for this work, particularly in Minnesota. In 2014, there were a group of concerned Minnesotans who saw, I believe, signage relating to Asian carp and efforts that were there for prevention, and the language that was used on those signs was concerning to them. And so they brought that issue up to their elected officials. So in 2014, there was legislation in Minnesota that changed the name for, at the very least, state agencies from using the term Asian carp to invasive carp. And common names within invasives or within the invasive species world can be kind of common. I have a few photos on the screen here, and all of these are various invasive species who have or had a name that relates to a geographic reference, so a place or place-based name. And in Minnesota particularly, 30% of the named invasive species on the noxious weed list or other regulatory lists for non-native species have a place-based common name. And while the name in itself of a geographic location may not be offensive on its own, we need to think about the words that we're using across a broader landscape. So not only social and political landscapes across the country, but also the words that we're using as professionals in our natural resources, education, and scientific communication. So when we think about words like eradicating and controlling populations and causing economic harm and preventing introduction, and we lay that over this broader social and political landscape, as an example, the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes in America, particularly since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, it becomes really easy to see why these place-based names are problematic when we're doing our invasive species messaging. And we're not alone in efforts to think about the words that we're using in our scientific communication. I think a lot of these examples that I have on the screen have already been touched on today, thinking about the term rough fish and how that can affect and devalue important native fisheries, the removal of slurs and geographic names by the Bureau of Land Management, thinking about indigenous knowledge and how that relates to the names that we should be using for species across the landscape. We just heard the story of spongy moth, and then at the end of last year, the American Ornithological Society also announced a plan to remove birds or names for birds after people to address racist and troubled legacies associated with some of those names. So in Minnesota, this is kind of what it looked like for us as we thought about a framework to think about which common names we were going to be using in our invasive species education and outreach. And the species shown here is the one that kind of spurred this work for us. There were about to be some new efforts on education and outreach on the species where there hadn't been that kind of work yet in Minnesota. At the time, the most common name for it was Manchu tubergourd. And especially thinking back to that 2014 legislation, we started this work in, I think, late 2018. So thinking back to that 2014 legislation, there were questions about, is this really the name that we want to put on all these new outreach materials that we're planning to create? So we worked on developing a framework. The first draft of it didn't have the effect that we wanted. The first draft kind of came through and it had still landed on using this Manchu tubergourd name. So we said, okay, we need to come back and rethink like what this framework is when we're thinking about which common names to use in our education and outreach. We had some additional conversations. We had colleagues who were born outside the United States who joined our conversations. And it led to this really great improvement in this framework. We called them the guiding principles. Next round of that came across golden creeper, which we thought was pretty good. Until it was brought to our attention that there's other species that are also called golden creeper. So we said, okay, we need to come back to this one more time. And this is where we've landed now. We refer to the species as red hailstone, and you can see in the image on the screen the structure on that species where it gets its name from. And this is the way these guiding principles are now. We consider them a living document, but they really haven't changed much since we landed where we did. And now we consider ourselves to be in this phase 4, where we're spreading the word, we're continuing to work on new species names. And I'm gonna talk about kind of what that looks like more specifically. So amongst the guiding principles, I've kind of boiled it down here to 4 steps that we go through. So the first one is that we try to encourage scientific names. As you heard from Sam earlier, that it doesn't necessarily remove having these geographic references within the scientific names, but it can help where there's regional differences in how species are referred to, and thinking and making sure that people are talking about the same species. But using scientific names alone also isn't a viable option when thinking about scientific communication, especially when looking towards the general public. They're tricky for folks to remember and pronounce oftentimes. So there's still a place for common names. And so we really need to think about place-based names as we're doing that. So we then evaluate what other common names are already in use. So we review databases like EdMaps, iNaturalist, a number of different federal databases to kind of come up with a list of names. And also, particularly for species that exist in trade, we may look on like trade pages or areas where they're sold and see other names that they might go by in those areas. And once we have that full list of names that are already in existence, we have a list of things that we try to avoid. So we start crossing names off of the list. The first would be these place-based names. We would cross out anything that has derogatory words, any common names that could easily be confused with other species or cultivars. And then what's left, we look at desirable common name traits. So what are the names that are going to be informative? Things that tell us about what the species looks like, what the host species might be. So for example, I would expect to find an emerald ash borer on an ash tree. Names, symptoms that you might see for like parasitic species or species that cause disease. These are the names that we're trying to go towards now so that it's actually descriptive of what someone might find when they come across that particular invasive species. So I'm going to bring as an example, share how this worked as we looked at Curbicula fluminea and thinking about what common name we were going to use for this species. This was another instance where there had been a newer discovery in Minnesota that led to some questions, and we were going to be doing some more education and outreach and really wanted to think about what name was going to be on those materials. So the first step that I mentioned was to evaluate other common names that were in use. So the list that you're seeing now were all the names that we could find that this species goes by or has gone by elsewhere. From that, we removed any of the place-based names from the list. Next, any potentially derogatory names from the list. Then we removed a couple of names that could be confused with other species or cultivars. And this is a spot where we reached out for some extra help. So our invasive species community of practice is a relatively small group. And particularly if you look at those of us who work in aquatics, it becomes a very small group of people. There's like 2 or 3 of us. So there's not a lot of us and not a lot of expertise to spread around. So we reached out to someone who is an expert with Curbicula to get some opinions on some of the names that were left in the list. And he had suggested too that we should remove because they were also used as common names for other closely related species. So that took out those 2, and it left us with golden freshwater clam, or what we usually say freshwater golden clam. And it's this great descriptive name. Freshwater describes the habitat that we might find it in. So lakes and rivers are a spot that we might expect to see this, and golden referring to the shell color. So in Minnesota now, within our group, we've gone through 19 species so far. 12 of them are worms. And this came about because, again, there was legislation that was starting to come forward, or rulemaking around jumping worms. So to get ahead of the game, there was a group that took the jumping worms on. I think this is one instance where there might have been, where there were new names created that didn't already exist. But Angie's here to talk about that. She was part of the group that helped evaluate the jumping worms. But there was a long list, it turns out, under jumping worms, many different species to look at. So that whole group was done at once. There have been 6 terrestrial plants that have gone through the process. And then I mentioned the freshwater golden clam already in the example, are 1 mollusk. And then if we look again at this list of names in Minnesota, where there's already regulation, or that are on these regulated lists, you can see 4 of these names exist on those lists. I think only 1 of these existed under a previous name on these lists, like at the time it was placed. So roundleaf bittersweet went previously by oriental bittersweet on the regulated list. And then the other 3 species, freshwater golden clam, jumping worms, and red hailstone, all ended up on lists after this process already happened. So they were never on this list under a name with a place-based reference. Okay, and then that leads us to how we're thinking ahead. So we're a local group. We're all University of Minnesota people, specifically University of Minnesota Extension. So we have state boundaries that we're generally thinking in, and we are continuing that work locally, but there are limitations to that. So again, we're in Minnesota and we share the information that we have and the names that we come about with others, but we're still one state across an entire nation. So the next spot we think about is engaging with others. So one thing that we already do, I had mentioned that we share these names. We talk to state regulatory agencies. We work with them. Oftentimes, some of them might even be part of the committees that are thinking about what the name selection process looks like for a specific species. But We're also sharing these with regional and national partners and databases. So we'll share names with, for example, EdMaps or iNaturalist. There's a wildflower database in Minnesota called Minnesota Wildflowers. And oftentimes they're familiar with this process and they'll make the change within their databases. But those are, again, limited spots. So the other piece is encouraging a broader adoption. So we would love to see more of this work happen at a regional or national scale, similar to what Entomological Society has been doing. We're really excited to see them taking on the place-based name issue as well, as they keep thinking about their Better Names project. But that's one group of taxa, and there's many other taxa. Some of them have groups that are naming authorities, some do not. So there's a much broader way to think about this, and having a larger regional or national focus can help prevent confusion with which names are ultimately selected. And that was my last slide. So there we go. So if you'd like to reach out, feel free to connect.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. So we have some time for Q&A here. We'll see how many questions we can get through. And so I think the first question I wanted to bring up was partially answered in the chat from Matt Nielsen at the USGS. And how would you rectify when multiple different groups propose different common names for particular species? For example, Minnesota's proposed freshwater golden clam for Corbicula, whereas the Freshwater Mollusk Conservation Society has proposed the basket clam. And Lee responded in the chat, or like in text, that the ESA was able to help kind of guide, and they were the final arbiter of the name, and they'd worked together for months on that. But there might not be an organization that has that kind of final say.
Tim, I'd love to add to that. One thing that's really important to know in the space of names is that some of the taxa and taxonomic groups have essentially a well-accepted arbiter of names. And insects is the best example of that. Birds is the other really good example of that. Other taxa don't really have an arbiter of names that is well accepted by all the different societies and states and federal agencies. And so I'm not an expert on this issue of this particular mollusk, but it may be much more complicated with mollusks because you don't have that arbiter and that mutually accepted that they're going to be able to hold the name and make that final decision. And that's just more complex.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee. And then Megan, do you have anything to add?
No, that's perfect.
Okay, cool. So this attendee would really appreciate a larger discussion on place-based names. Most in our region find it helpful to understand place of origin and feel that modifiers are problematic, like killer or murder, but that identifying by its origin and in some cases renaming based on new information is helpful to understanding that it is an introduction. If we drop origin and rename without this, it becomes much harder for managers and the general public to identify that the taxon is an introduction. So I think for our panelists, if anyone has any thoughts or responses to that on how we as managers that might be using this place-based information to more easily identify invasive species or non-native species.
I actually think that this ties in really well with one of the other questions that was asked about place-based names for native species here in North America. It's kind of a matter of positionality and where you happen to come from. Many of our North American species are invasive in other parts of the world. And so I think we should, if possible, talk to our international colleagues about how they're handling the naming convention stuff. I would just like to see a lot more of these conversations going in the broader scientific community, not just, Great Lakes region or America or like the United States of America or North America more generally. I think we have a lot to learn and can collaborate on this, and that might give us some ways forward that isn't just, kind of leaning towards the North American English speaking bias that tends to be present in a lot of the science that gets done.
And Lee?
Yeah, I think it's difficult in some ways because we have this norm that is historical to give some invasive species place-based names. And Sam Chan covered that about 15% do have a geographic name of some sort. And so it is, fairly common, but I would just love to point out the slide I showed with spotted lanternfly, which is a phenomenal name. It's evocative. It talks about the spots on the bug. It's not entirely scientifically accurate, but not in a way that really matters. It's not a fly. That's okay. But it's so much more helpful than if that had been named the Chinese lanternfly. That would be subject to a phenomenal amount of likely racist rhetoric and possibly additional ramifications for Asian American hate, given how incredibly obnoxious that insect is. And so when you reflect upon that example in particular, I think the really profound nature of a simple, descriptive, biological name, whether it's behavior or what it looks like, just appearance in general, has so many strong advantages over a geographic name in the context of invasive species. So when you compare the two, one of them really wins out. And I feel like that one is going to be something that you can see and describe an insect with that's helpful instead of potentially being used for harm.
Tim, there was a question asked earlier as to that there is value in having a place-based name because it helps in the communication that organism is not native to an area, and that not having place-based names actually decreases a manager's ability to communicate the seriousness of a certain species. The issue with that thinking is not an issue, but unless we're able to have every species of invasive species that have a place base, it's very challenging for us to actually use place base with just a minority at this point. And I'm not sure how we can get around that.
Yeah, I think maybe to build a little bit off of what Sam said, I think if you're maybe thinking of crayfish within the United States, where different species of crayfish are native or non-native to different parts of the United States. So when we're thinking of even things within the same country, something with a generic river basin name to indicate which watershed it's from might not be, it's place-based, but it really might not have that kind of indication that people are hoping for. And then I think the other thing that I'm thinking of in response to this question is that thinking, as an invasive species specialist or a manager, that I have tools at my disposal that I know how to use, like USGS, NAS database, other identification tools. I know how to get information on these things. And so I think that, at least for me, that I'd be willing to maybe give up some shorthand and communication and being able to go through a little extra work if I had to look something up quickly, because I know how to very quickly get that information. And I imagine a lot of people on this call also, or on the webinar, also know how to obtain that information. So if it's a little bit more responsibility for us, but then it makes a better communication product for us outwards, then I think that's a trade-off that I would be willing to make. So another question, and if anyone else on the panel or in the room has a question they really want to tackle, I'm open to suggestions. But how do we create arbiter organizations or people that can help say what, or I guess have some authority or decision on what a name might be, or how might we operate in a space where that doesn't exist?
Yeah, I would say that the work that the Entomological Society of America is really, it's a good template, a good model, and being able to actually get training on the organization, the logistics, the process that we can actually define more generally to other professions and species would be really helpful. So if you take that model and you substitute entomological, say with ornithological, for example, that would be really helpful, because right now having a template gives it scientific credibility and experience.
And this is Erin. I'll just add that I think one of the critical components is also to work with the federal agencies. They're the ones that have the names, they're in the databases already. And so the clam example is a good question. I was Googling, like, what is the Professional Association for Mollusks? And kudos to whoever pulled that up in the chat, because I'm coming up with that one on my own. But I think that working with them, because they are such important stakeholders, if there is no body that oversees the common names, that USGS and USDA are great places to start.
And I think I will add that I think there's examples of kind of, I don't know, like soft authority or of influence that people have that can help change things. I am hesitant to throw out an example on a webinar of 300 people that are being recorded. So if anyone wants to provide those, that knows for sure. But I think, like, for example, within some state regulation or something like that, or, you know, a state agency rule, you might be able to move things one direction with some of that language. There's also things you want to consider there, so that way you don't back yourself into a corner in the future if a name does end up being problematic. But that's something that we could all discuss another time. Are people working on better names to take on the task of clearly defining kind of native and harm?
Yeah, so we try to, at least at GLANCIS, which is the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System, we work across taxonomic groups. We've got plants, we've got fish, we've got all sorts of microorganisms, stuff like that. We try to be really clear about the difference between non-indigenous and invasive. By our definition, invasive implies harm. It's a non-indigenous species that has ecological and or socioeconomic impacts. And it's pretty important not to conflate the two. Our database has almost 200 different species in the Great Lakes Basin that are introduced. Only about a third of those actually meet the definition of invasive by that particular example. And a lot of non-indigenous species that don't actually have that many impacts, or that we simply don't have enough research on, can often get thrown under the bus when people associate all non-indigenous species with being invasive. So that's how we handle it, and try to be very clear from the outset when we are talking about non-indigenous versus the ones that are actually out here causing problems.
And then I think a last question before we actually have a break. So why not use the common name used in the country of origin, or I guess for people that actually have been doing some name change work, how often can you just use the name in the country of origin?
Depends on the language, especially if something is native to a bunch of different countries that speak a bunch of different languages. For instance, a lot of species are Eurasian. That falls across, quite frankly, a large conjoined continent. So who do you prioritize? Do you use the French name? Do you use the German name? Do you use the name in Slovak? So that sort of adds additional complications there if you do draw from that in particular. And so going through the sort of discernment process that the Spongy Moth group did, I think was pretty insightful, but definitely was a major lift.
Yeah, absolutely. Elle is 100% right. And one thing I will add is that, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation, a lot of the original names don't actually follow modern best practices anyway. And that's fine in their native ranges. Here in the United States, when you talk about US-based English common names, we should not be telling other countries what to do with their species that are native in their range. But we can opt to not adopt that name. And for instance, a really easy 2 examples with spongy moth. Spongy moth is often known as nun moth, and a depiction of a person that's associated with a religion would not have qualified under the Entomological Society's best practices. So a nun moth would not have been a name we could have adopted, but that's a common name for spongy moth in its native range in multiple countries, in multiple languages. And then also in one of the countries, it's called the apricot spinner. Go figure. As anybody who's familiar with spongy moth knows, spongy moth eats a tremendous number of different types of trees, not just apricot trees. So that name is kind of abstract as well as scientifically inaccurate. And so, for instance, that one wouldn't have been very suitable either. It was one of my favorite strange names that definitely has some sort of interesting historical basis, but wasn't applicable for the final name that we were going to select.
And this is Megan just chiming in a little bit more. So I think we did have look at list 2 from the native range when we were looking at Corbicula in particular. And one of the other challenges that we bumped into was, we had some of these names in the list. And when we had consulted with an outside expert on that species, he was like, yeah, it says that, but like, that's not really actually even that common of a common name in the native range. So I don't even know that we necessarily had like a full grasp of what all the options were. So I think kind of across all these, one of the biggest issues is like there's still a whole bunch of names from the native range to think about, but I think they're absolutely ones to consider.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for the great questions, the great discussion. I'm excited to get started with our set of afternoon presentations, focusing more kind of like consistent terminology and language use for invasive species communication. And our first presentation is on standardizing invasive species terminology for stakeholder education by Dr. Basil Iannoni. He is an associate professor and state extension specialist who uses his background in plant community ecology, ecological restoration, and biological invasions to inform strategies for increasing the ecological value of design and construct ecosystems in urban and residential landscapes. And I will hand it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Tim and Elle and NAISMA for inviting me. Full disclosure, I have no idea what I'm doing with linguistics here. I kind of fell into this project accidentally, and it's kind of been fun to contribute to this conversation of really great importance to conservation and biological invasions in general about how we communicate science and about this topic. I'm going to present a tool that we created, my colleagues and I, with the University of Florida IFAS Invasive Species Council, and I'll tell what that is here in a minute. That was really designed to help improve a tool for improving outreach and extension pertaining to invasive species. So the tools that I'm going to present today have been published in two publicly available resources. The first we highlighted national utility in the Journal of Extension. And the second, we highlighted its state utility in the University of Florida outreach online documents called the EDIS system. So those are freely available. If you can't find them, please reach out to me. I'm happy to provide those to anybody who's interested. And the problem that we're addressing here is just that when you start to look at biological invasions in general, there's just way too much jargon. And this is a list that I pulled together some time ago that I took maybe about 5 minutes to pull together. And I think it illustrates the excessive amount of words that we use when we communicate the science. That first line, non-native, exotic, foreign, alien, non-indigenous, all meaning the same thing. Native, indigenous, endemic, introduced, inventive, causal, established, naturalized. You go on, weed, pest, nuisance. Even we have confusing terms such as native invader, right? That people are using out and about and when you go into the real world outside of academia. And we see there's a lot of redundancy in these terms. There's misinterpretation. We hear a lot of correct usage. And there's generally confusion. And we see this through our outreach efforts as a major barrier to education and trying to communicate the importance of this topic to the general public about why they should care about invasive species, what they can do to prevent them, how they can manage them, why they should manage them, right? And there's also complications even within academics of what we mean when we talk about terms. I can talk to scientists who don't know biological invasions, and they're still using the terms incorrectly. And we developed some nice frameworks in academia to help communicate with each other. Here's one, Blackburn et al., that I think is actually quite useful, where an introduced species has to go through a series of barriers that it has to overcome to become invasive. And depending on what barriers it overcome, up here at the top, you can see red, what terms you could use to describe them. They even give you some management recommendations down here in the yellow. And then there's different ecological processes that the species has to go through in order to overcome these barriers. And here's a nice organized list of them, right? Okay, you might see what I'm getting into here. If you're the general public, this is still way too complex, right? It's great for communicating science. It's great for us to get on the same page about the terms we're using, but the public needs something a little simpler, right? Like when you go to the doctors and they tell you, you have this problem you don't need to necessarily understand the pure physiology behind it necessarily. You just need to know how to help to address the situation sometimes. So that's what we're trying to do here. And really, so what? And I'm preaching to the choir with the group here. I mean, of course, this is a map here of the shipping routes. Humans are incredibly connected species. We're connected, our cultures are connected across the globe. And as we're moving goods, products, and people around, we're also moving around a lot of other organisms with us, intentionally and unintentionally, that can have some serious ecological and economic impacts. So what we need is, the managers out there don't have the resources, and the scientists, we don't all have the resources to address this and tackle this problem on our own. We need support from the public, and we need the public's help. It's not going to happen without that. So that really requires public understanding. They need to clearly understand the issue and not be confused by a lot of terms. So the Invasive Species Council at the University of Florida came up with this objective where we said we wanted to come up with a list of standardized terminology that was concise and consistent, that could be easily understood by non-scientists, that would be of utility for stakeholder education and applicable across all invasive taxa. And that's because we're using similar or different terms across taxa for similar ecological processes involved in invasion. So I just want to mention, we were not trying to resolve any level of academic debate or any scientific debates here, simply trying to create a tool for communicating invasions to the public and educating. Background on the Invasive Species Council: this is a group of 39 scientists, extension specialists, and county extension agents. So people who study biological invasions from a research aspect, and people all the way to people who are boots on the ground trying to work with the public on educating and changing behaviors pertaining to biological invasions. And the expertise of this group also spanned all invasive taxa to help us try to ensure the broad applicability of this tool. And what we underwent was a year-long discussion aimed at forming a consensus on a list of terms that we could use. And I underline that word consensus for a reason, because I want to define it. It's a decision that everyone can live with and support. It might not be your first choice or somebody else's first choice, but you can live with it and you think it's going to be useful. You can support it. And as I go through this list, I just want to reiterate, this is a living document, okay? This is a living resource that we think, and I'm really interested in hearing everyone's perspectives on the utility or lack thereof, if you think that, of these terms that we came up with. So in the end, we came up with 7 terms, and I think we did a fairly decent job of making them useful. And I'm hoping that we aren't being insensitive with some of the, the talks I'm seeing today. The nativist framework that Elle talked about, obviously we're, might need to do some work with that. But here are the 7 terms, and I'll go through them in turn. We believe that they can explain most situations. We believe they can be used across taxa. We think they're easily understood. And I'll show you some examples of where they encapsulate more complex terms. The first 2, native and non-native. And this is simply species that do occur naturally or do not occur naturally in a specified geographic area. And we leaned on this term non-native instead of exotic because a lot of people who we worked with in the fisheries industry said that their clientele and stakeholders perceived exotic as not non-native, but actually fancy. So that was something that we chose this term non-native. And just to illustrate why we said we need to specify geographic area, here's an example. Here's a range map for the American alligator. And, we can say it's native, but that's useless, right? We have to say it's native to America, and more specifically to the southeastern United States. Whereas we can say the speckled caiman is non-native to the southeastern United States, but native to northern South America and Central America. And we have to also emphasize that a non-native species does not mean it's actually present, right? Elephants are not native to the United States, but they're not roaming around the United States freely either, right? So that's an example. The third term we came up with was introduced. And this is a species that's brought to a geographic area intentionally or unintentionally by humans. And I think it was already pointed out earlier that just because it's introduced, it's not negative, right? Doesn't mean it's negative. We have a lot of introduced species that have benefited our society when we look at agriculture, even the horticultural industry. Another term is established. This is a species having a self-sustaining and reproducing population in a specified geographic area without need for human intervention. Here's two examples in Florida, the scarlet ibis and tokay gecko. People debate if they're having ecological harm or impacts, but generally, but then regardless, they're established. And again, it's not always negative. And just to give you an example of what we meant by consensus, there's a group of people who really wanted us to use the word naturalized for this, including myself, because we thought naturalized was a useful term from an ecological perspective. But the agents, the county agents said, no, naturalized really confuses our stakeholders because they hear that word natural and they instantly think it's good. And we don't want this to be good or bad. We just want it to illustrate that it means it's established, right? And we also had questions in the chat about invasive and how we define this. So I'm excited to hear comments about that. We chose an operational definition here where they needed to meet three criteria. The species needed to be non-native to an area of consideration. It needed to be introduced intentionally or unintentionally. And it needs to cause or likely cause environmental, economic, or human harm. And this follows the U.S. executive order. And we also felt that it helped prioritize for managers and people which species, which established non-native species to manage first. We don't have the resources to manage them all. Let's go after the ones that are having these sort of negative impacts. And, Florida, where I'm from, it's an invasive hotspot. And here's just, I'm not going to go through these pictures, but it illustrates that these species are, for example, termites in the bottom left are having harm for infrastructure. Invasive mosquitoes are actually acting as disease vectors for people, and we have other species that are causing environmental and economic harm. Now, we came up with the sixth term, nuisance, and this is an individual or a group of individuals of a species that causes management issues, property damage, or presents a threat to the public or as an annoyance. Some caveats: we can't apply this to an entire species. We cannot, because, for example, a raccoon in the middle of the woods is just fine. But one that's outside attacking your dog or ready to bite you, that's a nuisance. It's applicable to native and non-native species. Invasive species, by definition of this, are a nuisance. And we chose this word because it can span across taxa, and it encapsulates the concept of weed and pest, which are used in plants and oftentimes in insects. And just to give you quick examples of this, here's a grapevine. It's a wonderful native species that provides shelter and food for wildlife in forests, but if in ecological restoration projects, it can become a nuisance. Or in your garden, it can become a nuisance. It's similar, I'm in Florida, there's lots of alligators in the lakes and rivers, and they're just fine. But in a human area here, it can create a nuisance issue for human-wildlife conflicts. Another term we came up with is range change, and this is when species, their current or existing range grows, shrinks, or shifts over time. And this happens to native and non-native species alike, and it can happen with or without humans. And we came up with this term because we needed to address these sorts of issues. Coyotes, armadillos, mangroves. These are species that are now moving into new areas. Mangroves on the right, largely because of climate change, and they bother people to a certain degree, but they're certainly not invasive. They're not non-native, they're not introduced, and they're not invasive, right? So we wanted to be able to explain that sort of idea to people. I'm going to speed up here. So here's our 7 terms again. We figured they could explain most situations, can be used across taxa, easily understood, and can encapsulate more complex terms. We also came up with some terms to avoid. The first one's native invasive. This usually describes a native species that's very aggressive, and it creates confusion. It confounds biological invasions, which are caused by people moving things over large distances, versus a native species that just creates a management challenge. We suggest instead of using this, just use the word nuisance. Another one, invasive exotic. It's used to describe an invasive species. It's redundant and confusing, and it causes people to think that maybe all exotic or non-native species are problematic when many of them are not. So we said just use invasive. Similar, invasive weed. Weed is a cultural term. right? It just means a plant that you don't want in a given location. It can be native or non-native. And it may lead people to think that weeds are all invasive and some of them are native. So we said to simply use invasive. And we've already hit on this with the politics. Alien, foreign, non-indigenous. It evokes political ideas, and based on what political belief system you have, some people might perceive this as negative. And again, we know that most non-native species are not that impactful. So we just said use the term non-native. It's a little less fueled. So in summary, there's our 7 terms: native, non-native, introduced, established, invasive, nuisance, and range change. We thought they were concise. We thought they could be easily understood by a diversity of stakeholders. We thought they were applicable across taxa. We thought they could be used to explain most situations, not all of them, but most. And we found them to be utility to stakeholder education. And I just wanted to give some evidence of the importance of the topic we're talking about today, but also the utility of what the tool we created. Since we created this tool, we were really kind of surprised by the number of invited talks we were given. I never knew this topic was so important. And then this tool has been incorporated into university courses, adopted at state and national outreach and extension programs. And these 2 documents I showed early on have been downloaded in 2 years over 8,000 times. So it really just illustrates the importance, not just of what the tool or the need for the tool that we designed, but also just the broader conversation that we're having here today. So again, thanks for having me here. So I'm interested in hearing everyone's thoughts and ideas.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated your presentation. I'm probably at least like 20 of those downloads because I can never remember where I saved this paper to my computer when I want to send it to people. I really appreciate the terminology and then all of the really clear reasoning for why you all suggest using things and not using things. I think it's great. Moving on to something similar, Gadfly Stratton. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. His current research focuses on stakeholder perceptions of aquatic invasive species risks, management, and engagement. And he will be presenting on setting better expectations for invasive species management through consistent terminology.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So yeah, I'm Gadfly. My pronouns are he, they. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Toronto, Scarborough. So readings from Canada, supervised by Nick Mandrak and Nicole Clank. And I'm here to talk to you about some trends that came up during the course of my PhD research, and gonna kind of share those and some guidance that came up from the various stakeholders I talked to during that work. So just to give some context, my thesis research was exploring perceptions of aquatic invasive species through a variety of methods. So we conducted surveys as well as in-depth one-on-one interviews and a focus group, which was really valuable for me. The folks specifically I was talking to were academics, policymakers, and then representatives from the public, all with an interest in aquatic invasive species and specifically in the Great Lakes region. So that's sort of the folks we were talking to and what we talked to them about. Our dissertation chapters, just to give an idea of the topics specifically that we focused on, were on the drivers of aquatic invasive species risk perceptions, perceptions and preferences towards management, experience and preferences regarding engagement, and then also denialism narratives. So a trend that appeared throughout our analysis was this idea of mismatched meanings. So we frequently found that different groups of people were using the exact same words, but they were referring to very different things. So we might be familiar with some of the more higher level disagreements that can happen when we're talking about invasive species. So how much money should we be spending? What species should we focus on? What are the impact thresholds that are acceptable? But I actually found that some of these disagreements were much more foundational. You know, you're trying to talk to people about invasive species risks, and they're not even describing invasive species or risk in the same way. So to move on to those kinds of more higher level conversations, you're not even sure people are beginning on the same page. And we found similar things with, you know, what does management mean? What does engagement mean? And different people were using these terms to mean very different things. So there would be disagreement about whether people felt they had even been engaged by the person who said they had engaged with them. So a lot of policy that we see about invasive species And research that's a bit less recent approaches these sorts of disagreements from what's known as a knowledge deficit approach. So it's this way of problematizing disagreements with stakeholders where the problem is that they don't understand. That if the public were simply better educated, if we just, we have this information, if we could just package it in just the right way that they absorbed it, then they would understand, what I was talking about. And that's the only problem, is that they don't understand the issue, and that's why they don't agree with me. And the other side of that coin is that we can end up dismissing people by thinking that because they don't agree with us, it's because they don't understand anything. And so then you end up dismissing the very folks that you're trying to reach out to for help. So more recently in human dimensions and stakeholder engagement spaces, we're seeing a shift more towards collaborative approaches towards engagement, which takes a lot more time and resources, time spent with communities and, sharing ideas within them rather than just simply, thrusting information at them and, just sort of waiting for them to absorb it. But it's ultimately more inclusive and respectful of your communities. So I'm going to go over some of these disagreements that came up during conversations with different groups. And there's some of the guidance that came up during a lot of our interviews and focus groups about how to rethink these issues rather than being a problem with the folks you're engaging and more of, a challenge that you can work through together. So invasive species was a common one that a lot of managers had issues with, that their stakeholders define these in, slightly different ways. So often it would be about the place of origin, and they would be confused why their stakeholders were referring to, for instance, all non-native species as invasive, or referring to impacts. And so any species that had a negative impact on them, they were referring to those as invasive. And so they'd be getting calls about, why aren't you dealing with X species? And it's like, because X species is native to this area. That species isn't invasive, but they just knew that it had an impact. Species can also have, hidden or unknown impacts. So a species that isn't necessarily on the radar of managers yet as being, we may know that they're not native, but we don't think of them as invasive because they don't have impacts. Local stakeholders within their own community, they may be more acutely aware of local impacts because they live in that environment and they can see those firsthand. And so a way we can start to think about these things is to question, what do the members of the community you serve know about invasive species? How are they viewing these issues? What are they prioritizing? And how can you share knowledge with them without dismissing their insights and perspectives? Risks was another big one that had quite a bit of pushback on some things. So during our preliminary pre-survey, we realized it was better to parse out different kinds of risks rather than just sort of having a generic risk. And those included, ecological, economic, human health, aesthetic, social, cultural, and religious and spiritual. And we actually got quite a bit of pushback from some folks during the survey in the comment fields, this particular from those who identified as researchers, asking why we were including things like religious and spiritual risks. We're like, I don't think that's really important. That doesn't make any sense to me. We focus on the ecological and economic. Why are you talking about aesthetic risks? I don't know what that means. And yet when we spoke with members of the public, for instance, sometimes when they would talk about the impacts of invasive species, they would say, well, the lake doesn't look the same anymore. And that would be, an aesthetic thing. But when you actually dug down into what they were talking about, sometimes it doesn't look the same. Meant, I don't see any of the fish I used to see here 20 years ago. Sometimes it means, we used to have fishermen out there all the time, and I don't see them anymore because there's, nothing to fish anymore. It's just sea lamprey everywhere. And so not digging down into, what these different risk types are, how they're perceived, but also how they're described. What are the initial words that stakeholders are using? If you just assume everything is about ecological and economic risks, you may be missing a big part of the picture. And it's also particularly problematic if anyone is consulting with Indigenous communities to, simply focus on, say, well, we're just going to focus on ecological or economic, because that won't always make sense to those communities. So for folks where, there's, not just an ecological connection to species, but where there's also a social or even familial relationship with different species, where the water itself is medicine, where you can, where there's religious and spiritual aspects to different interactions you are having with these species as individuals, that it doesn't always make sense to say, well, we're just going to talk about, economics, that there's, an $800 million cost to invasive species in the Great Lakes. You need to understand how the communities that you're engaging with, what do they define as a risk and as an impact? How do they speak about them? And how can you speak to them in a way that makes sense to them? So how can you help folks to learn about the risks that concern them, rather than simply saying, these are the risks that concern me, and you need to just sort of absorb that, be concerned when I say to be concerned, and everything else is irrelevant. How can you help people to prevent and mitigate impacts by focusing on, where their concerns are and the concerns of their communities? Management, there was a lot of disagreement among folks about what management meant. In this case, it was particularly between managers and the public. So managers would talk about how, well, obviously management, the goals are based on, what species are we talking about, in which location, how much money is available, those sorts of concerns. And so then we set goals based on that. And that may be very familiar to many of you, that you can't just have a standard of management that would apply to all species in all areas all the time. Whereas the public tended to assume that the ultimate goal of management was eradication. And so everything was sort of a step on the road towards eradication. So you would have managers talking about how, we've brought the populations of sea lamprey down by 90% in the Great Lakes. That was a great achievement. And they wanted to, now that we have that under control and the impacts managed, then, we should maybe focus on some other species. Whereas the public's response to that was often that, you're 90% of the way there. That's really great. So why stop there? Why are you giving up when victory is so close in sight? And it's this very mismatched way of viewing. And, you can't really say that either side is wrong. There are limited resources, and we do have to sort of pick our battles. But at the same time, it makes perfect sense to think that, that you would want to be able to remove all of an invasive species. If you're telling us that they have all these harms and they're dangerous, why don't you want to get rid of them? And so you can lead to this sort of confusion and conflict between groups. And so it's important when you're doing engagement with a community to understand, what does success mean to them? How can you communicate success in a way that highlights it in the terms that they'll understand, to try to, rather than just saying, well, you're wrong and you just don't understand that these are the limited resources and these are the goals that we have, but rather seeing that, if folks view it in this light, then how can you highlight things in the way that respects that you understand how they view things, you understand their viewpoint, and that it's important to you. Engagement was really interesting. A lot of managers, when asked about engagement, would talk about how their agency was very committed to engagement, and this was really important to them. And then you would ask them for details, and they would say that, well, they do a lot of posts on Instagram. And then just sort of leave it there. Whereas human dimensions researchers and members of the public even didn't always necessarily consider that to be engagement at all, or at least not on its own. Does anyone even actually reply to those Instagram posts? Is that really all that you're doing? Members of the public tended to say that they expected more one-on-one conversations, or, someone to come and do a town hall, or even to be able to, literally one person to one person to be able to ask an expert and have feedback and questions. That to them would be engagement. Someone posting a picture of an Asian carp on Facebook they did not feel engaged. Whereas the manager felt that they had done a lot of engagement. They posted that post, it said it got 1,000 views, they engaged 1,000 people. And so it's particularly problematic when you could be in a position where you say that you engaged a group and the group says, I didn't see any of that, I was not engaged, I don't even know who you are. So you need to know how the members of your community understand engagement. So what are their preferences? And there can be lots of different local, social, cultural expectations that people may have depending on the community you're engaging with. There could also be accessibility concerns. Does your community have a lot of elderly people? That may mean that social media is not going to reach them, but it may also mean that a one-on-one gathering downtown, if they're less mobile, that can also be off the table. So you want to make sure that you're meeting people with where they are, and that when you decide you've met with them, they also agree that they have met with you. So just some other things that came up during our focus group in particular was different communication styles, and that if you're wanting to be as inclusive as possible, that bi-directional communication is usually best, which is probably why just, putting up a picture on Instagram isn't the best. That bi-directional communication means it's going two-way, and people can ask clarifying questions and provide feedback. And that's not just that the public can ask, managers questions, that managers have a lot of things they can learn from local stakeholders as well. And you want to be able to ask those questions and get feedback from them as well. That you can produce definitions and goals together through this, through co-production. And when goals and targets are produced together, the outcomes are going to be better understood. If we decided initially that we wanted to bring, population levels down to 90%, then it's easier for us all to agree that was a successful goal that we reached together. But unidirectional communication can sometimes be needed. And so that was certainly a challenge that managers talked about, how it can sometimes feel awkward to do, but you can have urgent situations. So for instance, maybe in an area with an at-risk species suddenly has an invasive species in there, and you're worried that it might not make it, that maybe you don't have a year to get in on the ground and start talking to your community about it, that by the time consensus is reached, the species could be gone or irreparably harmed. So it's important that you maintain communication with your community and explain why that urgent action was needed, what had to happen, and get feedback afterwards for next time. And ideally, you would be able to create a framework beforehand. But if you have ongoing relationships with communities, then you can sort of set up a framework if an urgent situation happens where we need to take action. How would you like to be informed about it? What sorts of things do you want us to prioritize when we're considering really quickly what to do? Finally, inclusion versus exclusion. Generally, you want to be as inclusive as possible. It allows for diverse voices and perspectives. It can improve our data. It lets us understand and represent the communities that we're serving. And it encourages more participation. It makes people more likely to share resources, whether that be donating money, spending their time. And it's also often required for funding. So sometimes just, to get certain government funding, you need to have been as inclusive to a community as possible. But exclusion can paradoxically sometimes be required for inclusion. So the context of this discussion was when we were talking about invasive species denialism, in particular invasive species denialism, where essentially, this is when you have folks saying, well, this is a waste of time. You're never going to manage these species. We should not be spending any time on this, and just sort of sucking all the air out of the room, wanting to talk about nothing other than that we shouldn't be talking about this. Obviously, we need to hear alternative perspectives, even when they're ones we don't necessarily want to hear, that those can be valuable. But at the same time, if you're serving an entire community, you have a whole room full of people that came to talk to you and share their ideas, and there's one person taking up all the time and all the space to essentially tell us all that we're wasting our time and money. At some point, you do need to let them know that you've heard their point of view and you've noted it, it was valuable, you appreciate it, but that the rest of you are going to move on, because you do need to serve an entire community. That you don't want to be essentially excluding the community you serve and privileging this one loud contrarian in the room. So as awkward as it can feel, you also want to make sure that exclusion can be a tool to make sure that you're including people, that sometimes there are, negative voices that will prevent you from appropriately engaging the community, and you need to know when to temporarily stop engaging with them. So just some general guidance that came out. Many of our participants recommended having dedicated outreach and engagement professionals, that those that had those people on their teams talked about how valuable that was to them. that these people have, a lot of experience in engagement. They can do arm's length facilitation. So if you do get folks saying things like, well, that science sounds like nonsense and this sounds like a waste of time, they're talking to an engagement professional rather than the person who conducted the scientific research themselves. So they're a lot likely to be personally harmed or affected by those sorts of comments. They mentioned the importance of having, human dimensions and social science researchers on their team. That's what I do. So I'm probably biased and think, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I'll include. So just keep in mind that that's my own bias. But also because it helps you to develop best practices together over time when you have these dedicated people who can engage in these sorts of relationships over a long period of time, rather than reinventing the wheel, reintroducing yourself constantly. Having an ongoing relationship with a community can be really helpful. And you want to be able to co-develop definitions to be used in your community to ensure that everyone's on the same page, so that you don't end up in a situation where you're talking about invasive species risk and someone is saying, well, what's an invasive species and what's a risk? Your goals and expectations need to be clear and understood so that everyone can be in agreement about what success looks like, about what we're going for, what are our priorities in this community. And limitations and uncertainty need to be understood as well, that you don't want to always be acting like the problem is solved and every issue is a success story. You want to let people know about things when things were less than successful, so that you can reach out to them and say, well, how can you help me do this better next time? So finding invasive species engagement can be really challenging. It is a lot easier to just, focus on some ecological stats and just sort of hand them to people and tell them what the problem is. But in engagement and hearing what their problems are and what their solutions are and trying to work on things together is a lot harder. Disagreements can range from, simple foundational terms to management goals and resource allocation. Inclusive practices mean that you want to understand where communities and the groups you're engaging with are coming from and meeting them where they are. Dedicated researchers and outreach professionals, they can help to determine needs and best practices. But ultimately, you want to be co-developing terms, needs, and goals so that you can promote more collaborative outcomes. With that, I'm awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Gadfly. So moving on, we will have Angie Gupta, who is an extension professor in the Department of Agriculture and Natural Resource Systems at the University of Minnesota. And she is also a forestry extension educator. And she will be presenting on considering emotions when communicating and framing invasive species issues.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So, I'm going to talk about considering emotions and then framing. So I'll just get started. So my presentation, I'm going to cover sustaining us. That means us as natural resource professionals and our audiences, understanding your feelings and managing grief and building resilience. And then I'll switch to framing, recognizing the levels of framing, why positive framing is important, and how to apply that to invasive species. And I think it's really important to just be clear that 68% of US adults say that they have at least a little eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is defined by someone having stress or fear about the environment, future or current, because of man-made action. And in this particular survey, their eco-anxiety was really framed around climate change, as is fairly common, but I do try to bring this into invasive species to make sure it's relevant to us. All right, so I ended up on this journey learning about human emotions. I'm a forester, but because people kept calling me and crying, and I had no idea what to do with that. And so as a result, I launched a project, a participatory science project around jumping worms. That's an invasive species that's problematic. It doesn't have a scientific recommended management. And so people would call, they'd be very upset. And I would say, I'm really sorry. And so I ended up creating this project to see if we communally could come up with recommendations or at least move the field forward in ways in which to manage jumping worms. And then it became very clear that these emotions were very real. And so this was during the pandemic. I asked Master Naturalist volunteers if they would do a literature review of the emotional impacts of invasive species. We didn't find anything. So we had to broaden that to be the emotional impacts of climate change and then see what could apply. And we stumbled on this article, Sustaining the Conservationist. And I'm optimistic that Jody is going to drop in links as I talk, because I have a lot of links that you might want to read further about. And so in this paper, the authors first define conservationists as a person who advocates or acts for the protection or preservation of the environment or wildlife. So I imagine everyone on this call is a conservationist in this definition. And frankly, I imagine our target audience or the people that we're trying to communicate with probably also define themselves in this way. So this is about us. So then the author said that they proposed that the consciously or subconsciously conservationists, so you and I, live with a high degree of negative emotional experience as part of our daily awareness of the problems that ensue from human degradation of the natural environment. So this is broader than climate change, and I think could really apply to invasive species. So they found they did a survey that the results suggested that environmentalists who recall witnessing, so they have a memory and they can recall that, the negative anthropomorphic impacts of the environment, both large and small, so I think again, can apply to invasive species in your backyard or like whole scale changes, describe the experience using languages similar to people describing the anger or hopelessness characteristics of PTSD. Holy buckets, right? Like this is really pretty serious impacts that I just don't think are very top of mind for us. So the other thing that this paper had their survey tool as an attachment. And so I was able to review that survey tool, make amendments and changes, and then apply it to my jumping worm participatory scientists. So I did that. And in 2021, volunteers, again, these participatory scientists in the survey results expressed that they had a lot of sadness, fear, panic, impatience, anger, increased negative thoughts, and tears as it related to their jumping worm issue. So this invasive species was causing all of these powerful emotions. But this is super important and bold. By participating in this participatory science project, participants' feelings became more positive, reducing worry, increasing confidence, increasing attention to environmental change, and it increased their jumping worm outreach efforts. So this is really powerful, right? We can help people feel better about not only invasive species, but about the climate as a whole by giving them hope and agency. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. In addition, we learned that even when jumping worm management costs money and take time, these respondents reported a sharp increase in that effort to manage jumping worms. And this was really counter to the green industry's fears. They really feared that people would just stop gardening, they would give up, it was too hard, there was no recommended action. And that isn't what we found at all. We also discovered that you and I, professionals, as communicators, must manage the stories and actions we talk about, because those things, the things that you and I say, cause anxiety, mourning, anger, hopelessness, and they can cause motivation. So we need to tailor our message so that people aren't so upset, so mournful, so hopeless that they can't do the action we want of them. We need to frame it in such a way that they have hope and agency, that they can do something, and that something will make a meaningful difference so that we can get to where we want to go, a place with fewer invasive species. So practically, what did I do with this information? So I reached out to my volunteers, I created opportunities, but now if you go to the Jumping Worm site for the University of Minnesota Extension, you're gonna find this, Managing Your Emotions, and it links to a document that I think may be showing up in your chat shortly. And then I just created a new document for my Forest Pest First Detector volunteers, and I decided this morning to have that quickly reviewed, and I provided that for you as well. And that's really about how to manage your own emotions. So anyway, my point is we can move in this field in ways that help people to become more resilient. So I've been talking about eco-anxiety and trying to frame it around invasive species, but there's this other paper, Eco-Anxiety and Environmental Education, and this really talks about the feelings. So eco-anxiety is a feeling, but it really bounces around these others. And so these are things that we're familiar with: being overwhelmed, feeling fear, having worry, grief, guilt, anger, enthusiasm, stress. And then these can sort of manifest in things like helplessness or confusion, shock, trauma, solastalgia. I'll define that in a moment. Shame, we don't want to lean too far into that one. Excitement and expectation. So can we lean into those so we can enable people to make change? So here are sort of the big ideas. And so now I really want to put these words into action so we can all use them and create a resilient community. So if you don't know these words, solastalgia, that is the stress caused by environmental change. So an example I use is if you grew up on a farm and you go back and now it's a housing development, you might feel solastalgia for that place that you knew and loved and no longer exists functionally. Serious leisure, this is really for our audience. So many of my participants really viewed themselves to be good gardeners, and they view themselves to have been the person that brought jumping worms into their landscape, which may well have been the truth, but it certainly was not intentional. But then that really infringed on their self-image. And I think we have that when it comes to our careers, right? That is a career, not a serious leisure. But when we realize that maybe we didn't do the right thing, maybe we weren't using the right name for a long time. And so are we a bad person? Did we screw up? Are we bad at our job? And this is a type of emotion that has, if you're a hobbyist, it's called serious leisure and you're infringing on that, right? But this was a really big deal for my volunteers. Disenfranchised grief is any kind of grief for which our community doesn't have rituals. So when my volunteers went up to garden centers and said, they asked about jumping worms and they literally got the crazy lady look, they were essentially running into this. They were going through all of these forms of grief. They were trying to ask questions and learn. And the people were just like, who are you and what are you talking about? Common in the literature is talking about this when it comes to if you have an addict in your family and we don't know how as a culture to really help the family members deal with the grief that they experience. So if that's helpful, that framing. Anticipatory grief, I have found myself deeply affected by anticipatory grief this winter. I'm in Minnesota. We have no snow. We've had almost no snow all winter. It has been shockingly warm. It was 68 degrees yesterday. And I am experiencing anticipatory grief for the things that will not go as I think they should in the spring and summer, right? We don't know what is going to happen, but it certainly is not likely to be normal. And that is already causing me grief. So we can manage these, we can build resilience. So first, we can recognize those feelings, we can state them, we can talk to others about them, and we can use the proper language. That just normalizes them. We can create rituals to process those feelings. So, that garden may not be the same, that forest may not be the same, certainly in the short term. We can take a moment, reflect on what was lost and what was gained. We can honor the damage and honor the memory. And then remember, memories will live on. We can make them happy, right? We tried to make change. We engaged a neighbor. We made a new friend. We learned something new. These can be positive, even if we don't feel good about the whole, right? And so we have that power. Also, I alluded to this before, but empowering hope and agency is critical to having resiliency and empowering action. And so what that means is we need our people, we need us and others to be hopeful about the future and feel as if they can make meaningful change to get to that more hopeful future. So that then enables them to learn, engage, explore, explain, evaluate, foster a sense of belonging, strength, opportunity, growth. These are good things. We need to give people that space. Remember, nature-based human health has benefits. Like every time you're outside in nature, you're getting exercise, you're breathing clean air, you're relaxing. These are really valuable for human health. They are not lost even in a changed landscape. And this picture on the left, I just want to say there's research out of the Mayo Clinic that pretty nature pictures with water are the most calming. So if you go to the nature clinic, you will find on doors and windows and ceilings all around that campus pictures of nature with water, because those are the most calming and they want to create a calm atmosphere in that what can be a really stressful medical situation. All right, then I'm going to talk about building resilience. And this is you and me and together and everybody. So, right, we can build resilience by making meaning of loss, which can move us forward. And resilience only grows in tough times, right? And so when you get down, you have a really bad day, think about things that can make you hopeful. So in this study, Ellen Keasley, propagating collective hope in the midst of environmental doom and gloom, discovered that 21 of the 22 individuals she interviewed chose specific things other people had done as their source of hope. So other colleagues that do something that you admire, that can be a source of hope. It doesn't have to be grand, monumental, mountain moving things. It can be the person that stops and takes a lunch break. Similarly, I put this picture in because it's Minnesota Invasive Species Advisory Council's Carol Mortensen Award. It cannot be for professionals. I'm accepting it on the Assisi Heights nuns in Rochester who do great invasive species removal work. And so these are inspirational stories that we can tell, even though often our world frames around the negative. So building a culture of wellness is important, and that can be done with a lot of little things. It can be done by taking wellness breaks. It can be done by taking a lunch break. It can be done by meditating or yoga. It can be done by just breathing deeply at your desk. But these are things that we can do that will help us be resilient and continue to do this work that we often love and have a passion for. So I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about frames. So I'm going to define these things. So first we have to have values. So values are these really big ideas. And when you frame a message for a community, you need to know what their values are. And so these might be things like freedom, community, responsibility, or stewardship. So in our space, I find we're often talking about responsibility to our fellow humans or our fellow beings or our environment, or stewardship, our environment, or stewardship of our resources. So once we've defined and figured out what the people that we're trying to communicate with, what they value, then we get to work on issues. What are the issues that are important to that community? So issues are more narrow, such as the environment, education, healthcare, childcare. And so for us, if we can lean into responsibility or stewardship and then environment, if those are important to our communities, then we can move on to the next step about message. Message, focus on the specific issue or policy about invasive species management or a tax credit. But until you've done the hard work of listening and learning about the values and the issues, you really can't do the good work of messaging. So you need to figure out what that is. So here are some tips for framing. So first, you have to figure out the value of your audience, and that takes good listening and good questions. I'll talk about that in a moment. You need to understand that whatever you're recommending has to have impact to the community, and it needs to be impact they care about. You need to support your message with both words and images. So just to be clear, this image, I really like it, but that is a dead snag. It is not a live tree with a heart in it. But I do think it's a powerful image and I like it. There's people might choose a different image, but you want to use them both. You want to limit the number of charts and graphs, and you want to lean into the narrative story that gives context to the issue. People love a narrative story. You want inspirational solutions. And I think the last speaker alluded to this. It may not actually be the solution that's so inspirational, but if it came out of a fourth grade classroom, that might be the inspirational part. If the community came up with the idea, then all of a sudden it's more acceptable, even if it's the common management approach, right? How that happens can make a difference. Informational problem of origin. So again, where that problem was perceived and identified can matter and can help you with your messaging. So if the community said, look, we have this problem and we need help, that's very different than me walking in saying, you have a problem and you need help. Mentioning the long-term consequences of the action you want them to take or the action they're intending to take or not taking action can be helpful. And you have to use a reasonable tone. No one wants to be lectured to. Nobody wants to be shamed. You need to leave them with hope and agency, not anger, not resentment. So we need to think about those things. So I think this is a really great example of framing. It's a positive message. It's from a trusted messenger. It's on the NISAW website. So I think a link will be coming to your chat soon. And it talks about some noxious weed work they did in Door County, Wisconsin. So I did not write it, but I think it's just a really great way to frame out an issue, to have all those parts in it. So if you're looking for example, I suggest that one. Now, I think I have alluded to positive framing, but I just want to be clear. It is important to use positive framing because negative framing can cause problems. So it actually takes longer for the brain to process negation, so negative messages. And recall errors are more common, especially replacing negatives with positives. So they can actually completely switch the message. And when they get home and tell their family at the dinner table, they may get your primary message incorrect. So you want to try to use those positive frames. And often the first reaction is to evoke when you evoke a negative frame is by trying to repeat it. So people hear it and then they do it again, and that isn't helpful. They also try to revoke it. So like if I have teenage boys, 2 of them, and if somebody says like all teenage boys are hoodlums, I immediately think, well, my teenage boy does this and that, and these are all positive things. And let's be clear, on any given night, they might act like hoodlums, right? But if you tell me that all teenage boys are, I will immediately then try to revoke that negative framing. And that's apparently very common. So how can you, without repeating a negative frame the issue positively with an invasive species? And I think this is a good example. So imagine you're at a county commissioner or a township meeting and someone says, managing invasive species in the park is a waste of time. A good response would be not managing invasive species isn't a waste of time. It should be data from our neighborhood counties has shown the increase in park usage by residents and visitors after they began managing invasive species. Or I was out, again, it's super warm and we have no snow. So I was out managing invasive plants over the weekend, and I was on a very steep hill, and this gentleman looked down like I was crazy. And he said, "Are you okay down there?" I said, "Yes, I'm fine." And he continued to look at me like I'd just fallen down the hill. And I said, "I'm just removing invasive plants." And he goes, "Oh, that's a never ending job." And I looked at him and very sincerely said, "Oh no, I'm almost done," which I am. I'm very pleased. But I didn't have to repeat the negative. I didn't have to lean into what he said. I just sort of corrected it and frankly went back to my work. But that's the kind of way to reframe it positively. So this is kind of for you and me. And this is, I tried to put this together in a way where you can see where you've switched over and you started to disengage. And so some common things that you and I can do is create the behavior that we want, make it normal. And that's normative messaging, which I didn't really go into, but we can do this. So at my house, I value native plants. And so I have this sign that talks about native plants for pollinators. My family values exercise. So we have a basketball hoop right in the front yard for everyone to notice. I'm engaged locally. And so this was a sign from a couple of years ago about the local school board issue. And I made that declaration, and I tried to positively frame it. And there was action that I asked for. We value team sports like soccer. That's in my front yard. I mean, thankfully, my neighbors are relatively kind and forgiving, but these are ways in which you normalize these types of behavior. Public declarations like the two signs are another way you make that very clear. Accountability buddy, you see this in dieting and some healthcare initiatives a lot, but you can apply this to invasive species. So if you want to make sure that you really do get out to that park and you really do pull that invasive plant out regularly, like get a buddy to do that with you. At my house, I've contributed to carbon credits for our flights. And at first I just tested it and did it by myself. And now it's a family activity. So there's a level of accountability in that. Talk about eco anxiety when you're experiencing it so that becomes a normal thing and it's not abnormal. You're not a freak or crazy. And then if you start to find yourself getting passive or silent or reverting to inaction, like this is when it's time to really sort out how you can become more resilient and re-engage in these conversations. I think we really started to see that with political division. And it turns out when people get to those ways of being passive and silent and inaction, we can't make that meaningful change that's important to move things forward. So just recognize those things happen as a protection mechanism, but we need to figure out how to get out of that. So I'm not going to go in to how to do this, crafting normative messages, but if you're a communicator, I would recommend this. It really talks about different types of normative messaging and how you can really lean into the best types. And then I'm almost done for an Empower You course, which we give away for free. It's a flipped classroom course that empowers community members to engage decision makers around invasive species. And there's a parallel curriculum that engages decision makers around natural resources. So think fire and water more generally. If you're interested, send me an email and I'm happy to give that to you. But really, I want to bring your attention to these two documents. So on the left is this feelings and values inventory, which has been talked about. These are words that can help you understand what the values and feelings are of your audience. They can help you sort out that triangle so you know how to frame it. The one on the right, 6 types of probing questions. These are questions that you can ask so you can get full and robust answers that enable you to listen for those feelings and values. And so I find that good reporters commonly use these 6 types of probing questions. And I enjoy listening to that so I can sort of get ready and practice those good questions myself. I think most people in the world would benefit from those 2 documents, including natural resource professionals. We include it in this curriculum for our community members, but I think they're really good resources. So with that, I have no idea how much time I have, but I will stop sharing and yield the floor. And if there's questions, I can take them and we'll do that later. Thanks.
Thanks, Angie. You were right on time. So if you missed introductions the first time around, hi, I'm Tim Campbell. I'm the Invasive Species Program Manager for Wisconsin Sea Grant. I'm also the National Sea Grant Office AIS Liaison. I'll be presenting some work that I've worked on with Dr. Brett Shaw from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is the wrong title slide. So Laurel, I hope your slides are in here. If not, you can share them. We'll also be sharing some work from the Nature Conservancy as well that talks about some message frames from social media message tests. I came to this work from the idea that the message frames people think are effective might not be having the effects that people think they do. People naturally lean into militaristic frames, kind of this good versus evil, us versus them. We're at war with invasive species. we've already talked about why this can be problematic. Same with some of the nativist frames, that they're not native, they're not from here, we don't want them. I think it's easy for me to understand how people could intuitively come up with some of this language. I could also understand how people might not make the links to how this could be problematic and be maybe hindering our management efforts. And so there has been like some research on different message frames and how that impacts how people feel about invasive species and their willingness to take action. One paper looked at the invasive species either as the driving force of environmental change. So this idea that, say, zebra and quagga mussels in the Great Lakes made it so clear that you can see shipwrecks now, right? That's kind of the driving force of environmental change versus invasive species being kind of passengers of environmental change. So because degraded environments and human activities, they've spread into new areas. So when you talk about invasive species as the driving force of environmental change, people are more likely to have a higher increased risk perception and are more willing to take action. There's also been some work on kind of more outreach focused messaging, looking at different frames, just informational frame, a regulation-based frame, descriptive, norm-based frames, and looking at people's kind of willingness to take action. And in this instance, a regulatory frame was a little bit more effective than the other frames. And just for all of your references, here's a few other papers you can check out looking at militaristic language use and responsible metaphor use within invasive species management. So check those out if you'd like to read some more. So when thinking about all of this and through some of the other work I've done with Brett Shaw, we were really wondering, how do different message frames that people use impact the actions people might take in regards to invasive species? And so we decided to set up a project and provide data on the impacts of different invasive species message frames. And we wanted to do something in as much of a real life setting as we could with the limited funding we have. And we thought Facebook was a great place to do this. And we were able to test which frames are most effective at generating like a lowest cost per click and other engagement metrics like likes, comments, and those sorts of things. And then we also had some data that we were able to compare metrics by gender, but we did not report that here. And so we had 5 different message frames: the militaristic, the nativist, the hitchhiker, protective, and science. I'll show you all that in a second. In this context, visuals have a greater impact than text on how people can perceive the message of a social media post. So we worked with an artist to capture some of these message frames that people commonly use in invasive species communication. Pilot tested this at a fishing expo. We showed people kind of the drawings of the different metaphors that we were going for and had people try to explain what they saw. And generally, people got what the message frame was. And also should point out that this is a lot of fun. Hopefully you all get to engage in fun work from time to time. So these are what our posts on Facebook look like. We have the drawing. This is the science frame that's just zebra mussels on an outboard motor prop. And then the text reinforces kind of the visual there. And something our artists took care to do was make sure that the text was pretty similarly sized, color and contrast was similar across all the drawings. So that way, just because something had like neon green and yellow, people weren't clicking on it or something like that. So this is our militaristic frame, zebra mussels on little naval boats, our nativist frame, kind of trying to make people feel a little uncomfortable with these outsider zebra mussels. Our protective frame, the kind of you can do it, you can help protect Wisconsin's lakes. And our hitchhiker frame, just these hitchhiking zebra mussels hopping on a boat. We purposely did not use the Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers brand, just so we weren't running into kind of whether we were testing the brand or the message frame itself. Our message test consisted of 5 4-day message tests on Facebook with $250 each, advertised to men and women who boated or fished in Wisconsin. So we spent a total of $2,500 and reached more than 270,000 people, which was pretty cool. So if you're thinking about doing any of this kind of research, it's a good way to do outreach and research at the same time. It's a lot of buildup for an ANOVA to look at the different metrics that we measured. So we looked at cost per click, And nativist, militaristic, and science all had the same cost per click, with hitchhiker protective frames being less cost effective for sharing. Almost everything was the same except for hitchhiker, which had more sharing. And then everything was commented on similarly. Something we noticed looking through the comments that in the future, I would try to do in a more rigorous way is that even though the number of comments were the same, they're not always helpful on the nativist frame. This is just a bunch of comments that I don't think is really helpful towards our management program, and don't really think we need this conversation. But on the information and science-based frame, we had more kind of positive responses, people talking about their experiences with mussels or what they've done. So I think that's a fruitful area for some future research and something that we'll be thinking about when we're using different message frames. And there's also a recent paper that came out that looked at militaristic and xenophobic language in Facebook posts, and they used more of a big data approach as opposed to experimental approach. They were able to grab all of the posts from 10 years across government pages and some NGO pages of certain size, and found that militaristic and xenophobic language in Facebook posts did not lead to greater engagement than kind of any other language used or message frame.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Laurel Downs and I work with the Nature Conservancy on the Don't Move Firewood campaign, and we are right in the midst of doing a study on testing some message frames using A/B tests on Facebook. So it's similar to Tim's work, but different as well. So specifically, we're looking at comparing emotional protective type language with more objective science fact-based language. And so we have 28 sets of ads that we've used over the past 2 years. Each pair has the same photo, the same audience, time frame, everything. Really, it's just the language in the messages themselves that differ. And we worked it out with the A/B testing algorithm to set link clicks as our goal for engagement. So the link will send folks to our website, one of our pages, whatever is related to the ad itself. And what we're looking at with the data we have so far is cost per results, or clicks in our case, and click-through rate as a kind of testing for engagement. And so that is the ratio between link clicks and impressions. And if you're like me and had no idea what impressions were, impressions are the total number of times a post was visible in a user's timeline. And then so looking at how many clicks compared to that. This is an example of one of the ads that we've run. A is always emotional protective language. B is always science, more objective language. And this is just to give you some visuals for what we're talking about here. So subjective language like beauty, spotted lanternflies ruin apples, protect your trees, versus the more objective, spotted lanternflies infest this, habitats, contaminated firewood, invasive pests. And just a pro tip too, we've noticed over the years in our outreach that really pretty pictures of the insects themselves tend to get the most engagement and take off on Facebook. We mixed it up for this study, but again, each message pairing like this always used the same photo, so that didn't muddy the waters in any way. And some of our preliminary findings here. So overall, across every ad, it was about 40 cents on average across $26,000 worth of spending. And again, that's over 2 years. This got us almost 112,000 total clicks. And what we're doing right now is comparing that cost per result for each of the pairs as well as the click-through rate. And so we're using 2 sample proportion tests to do that, to look at the winner, A versus B, in each of those pairings. What we found so far is that there was a significant difference in the 2 sets, with emotional protective language being a little bit less expensive, being the winner in about 71% of the time compared to the objective language. But we did see a lot of variability here, and we did not see a significant difference with click-through rate. So we're doing more testing this spring. We're working with a new contractor. We're still trying to figure out the mysterious ways of Facebook and their algorithms, and just trying to make sure that we're controlling everything we can. So we're hoping to have those results this summer and then eventually publish something to that effect afterwards to hopefully be able to share these results with everyone. And just the caveat to this, we are trying to use all those best practices already. So, inclusive language, we're not going the militaristic or xenophobic route, anything like that. It's just fine tuning those different words within that best practice set. And so there might not be a big difference, and we're not sure, but stay tuned for those results. And that's all I have. So thank you.
Thanks, Laurel. So just to wrap up our presentation, I think just some kind of notes on some of the social media tests. Some of the things that we did in our project was we tried to maximize the effect size. I'm not sure I'd recommend that anyone use the drawings that we use specifically for outreach. So, that's one thing to consider. On the plus side, working with Facebook, we think that it has a lot of external validity. It's real world, as real world as social media can be. It's people out there interacting with our messages, like they would any other message that's coming across their feeds. So we think there's a lot of value in this work. And I think that there's probably a lot of people out here working with social media, maybe running their own advertising campaigns. And so I think this touches a little bit on a question that's in the Q&A, how you can get money for more engagement and outreach. I think there's sometimes a way to turn your outreach into research and have them feed off of each other. And so maybe there's opportunities for people doing this kind of Facebook engagement to tie some research in there too, or some evaluation in there with a little extra thought. And so I think our take-home point is that, at least in this work, that the militaristic and nativist language didn't really perform any better, didn't have any increased engagement, and the protective science hitchhiker kind of more positive frames can do just as well. So for me, it really questions the utility of using the militaristic and nativist frames. So thank you. I'm going to hand it off to Neha Savan, who will be presenting on just language for invasive species communications. And Neha is a wildlife and fisheries ecologist for New York State Parks Natural Resource Group. She conducts research and monitoring to advise on protecting, enhancing, and stewarding the city's biodiversity, and serves as a steering committee member for the Just Language in Ecology Education Project.
I'm Neha, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am really excited to be here. I've learned so much already with all of the presentations, and I have so many thoughts about the things I wish I would have framed a little differently in my presentation, but we're all here to learn. So today I'll be presenting on parts of a journal article that me and some co-authors are preparing that describes our efforts to shift language and framing of invasive species in urban contexts. I'm speaking on behalf of my co-authors who are listed here, who are from multiple organizations from across the US, from Lenape-Hocking or New York City, where I'm based, to Atlanta and Seattle metro regions. Many of us are also part of a collective called Just Language in Ecology Education, or Just Language for short, that has been working for the past 4 years to organize discussions around building inclusive language around the environment. Before diving into the presentation, I wanted to introduce myself a little more specifically. I am based in New York City, but I grew up in Southern California, in the suburbs of Southern California. And I grew up as a child of recent Hindu Indian immigrants. You can see me smelling roses in the suburbs there, and this definitely was staged by my parents. But I was always obsessed with the living world, especially animals. But it wasn't until college, when I took my first ecology and conservation classes, that I learned that studying and caring for the natural and cultural resources was an actual viable career path. In those classes, I was taught to separate my personal experiences and my family's experiences from the science and the natural resource management that I do. And during the past 10 years, I've worked in these sectors in regions across North and Central America, in rural to urban contexts. And I often felt like I had to hide my personal feelings or emotions related to exclusionary science practices and communication practices, or if I expressed them, that they would be discounted. So all that to say, I'm very excited that we're gathering here today to be discussing this very topic and finding ways to move forward towards inclusive and evidence-based science communication together. The other thing that I'll mention that I thought of during seeing everyone's presentations is that my big interest is also to understand how to help city residents of diverse backgrounds connect to non-human nature while caring for their environment. And I'm especially interested in how this happens in immigrant communities. And this really motivates a lot of my work around this topic in New York City. So today we'll be talking about ways that we have sought to address some of the critiques of dominant framings of invasive species management and explore alternatives in 2 different settings. First, within a municipal natural resource agency, New York City Parks, which is my employer, and within a national collective, Just Language. And then I'll wrap up with a short review of our lessons learned and open questions. So usually when I give these presentations, I need to provide extensive background and context for why we're wanting to shift language. But today I have the luck of going nearly last in a series of presentations explaining these intersections exactly. So thank you, previous presenters. I'm only going to review these briefly. Critiques of dominant invasive species have existed for at least 2 decades, mainly the xenophobic undertones, which you've heard earlier, the militaristic methods of communicating the phenomena, nativist ways of framing things, native equals good, non-native equals bad, and the simplistic ways that invasion is described that obscure the human systems responsible for their impacts. Miscommunications can lead to misunderstandings, such as perceived disrespect by community partners, microaggressions in the workplace, and temporary solutions such as investments in the removal of a plant or a species without investments in longer-term maintenance. Challenges in invasive species management have only increased since these critiques began, and climate change is going to make things even more complicated, which signals a need for different communication approaches. Carefully considering words and framings can not only decrease misunderstandings, but can also help increase the efficacy of describing and collaborating on conservation goals, such as ecosystem function, biodiversity conservation, and facilitating human and nature connections. To move towards improved communications, it's important that we discuss values regarding nature. Research has shown that value differences are often at the heart of invasive species conflicts, including the ones around language. Invasive species and their impacts are perceived differently depending on a person's familiarity with the species, their exposure to media, and their social cultural identities and their value systems. So in the figure on the right, you can see that there are different value groupings. And this figure is from a paper from Chan et al. And the first grouping is instrumental values, which is the utility that people see in nature. So it's often economic uses, recreational uses, ecosystem services. Another grouping is intrinsic values, or the fact that nature should just exist on its own without the value that it brings to people or the use that people have for it. And then you have relational values, which are social relationships that people may have with nature and responsibilities that people feel towards nature and non-human species. And these values are really important in communicating, as Angie just mentioned. And environmental management is often presented as objective and value neutral, even though it usually reflects intrinsic and instrumental values. And these values are also important to discuss because these values can connect to cultural heritage, as Western values often encompass instrumental and intrinsic values, whereas relational values are more commonly found in indigenous cultures. So we know that social context matters. We know that values matter. But how do we acknowledge and consider the social context of invasive species when communicating with audiences that may have different values or different lived experiences? What words and what framings can we use that work with multiple values? These are some of the questions that me and my co-authors have been grappling with and asking within our own context. And first, we'll talk about how we've tried to talk about that at New York City parks in the context of city ecosystems. So in the environmental world, urban natural areas are often portrayed as degraded and of low ecological value. And maybe some of these images might come to mind when you think about urban ecosystems. I'm here to turn that assumption around and show you that visually, at least, urban ecosystems can be biodiverse and contain lots of locally evolved species in a variety of habitats. And by visually, I mean I'm not showing you numbers or giving you statistics, but showing you pictures instead. New York City Parks owns about 30,000 acres of land in the city, making it one of the biggest land managers in the city. And about 12,000 of those 30,000 acres are natural areas. So there are forests, salt marshes, meadows, and freshwater wetlands. And because our parks are often full of people, here are a few examples of parks across the city where you can see volunteers actively stewarding and caring for the salt marshes in the Bronx, the forests in Manhattan, Brooklyn street trees, and a freshwater wetland in Staten Island. These stewardship activities include debris removal, soil decompaction, and invasive removal, or as we like to say, vegetation removal. The simplistic framings and language that are often found in common invasive species communications doesn't always work for urban areas. In cities, land managers don't just manage for introduced and invasive species, they can also manage for locally evolved species that have become overabundant, like white-tailed deer whose herbivory are restricting the regeneration of many herbaceous and tree species in our forests. In addition, invasive species removal is often just the starting action, but active planting and long-term maintenance is usually essential, depending on the ecosystem that you're caring for. Communications usually focus and over-rely on the removal or eradication of species while leaving out some of the care-based and constructive actions of management. And finally, non-native species can actually offer benefits in the urban context. Introduced red-eared sliders can offer ways for city residents to connect to reptiles. And due to PrEP releases, it's unlikely that sliders could be eliminated from ponds for any sustained period, not even considering the ethical issues involved in that. And nor is it likely that sliders will move to other ponds just because there's not much habitat connectivity across our city ponds. And it's not likely that native turtles would immigrate. And so in this case, we can celebrate the benefits that red-eared sliders and invasive species bring our city residents. And with street trees, there are only a handful of native street trees that are native tree species that can thrive in the challenging environment of a street tree bed. And so New York City Parks prioritizes risk through diversification, trading the benefit of native trees for, say, wildlife for the resiliency in our city landscape. So, as you probably know, city ecosystems also include incredibly diverse human communities with different cultures, languages, lived experiences, and value systems. And this is definitely the case in New York City. The population of the borough that I live in hosts about 55% immigrants from all over the world. Many city residents may hold religious or moral values of nonviolence, or they may relate to the plants and the animals that we're choosing to remove. Militaristic framings won't work well in this context, and nor will nativist framings, especially if the audience has heard similar language used against them. At the same time, there are many residents that only want native species planted in their residences and complain if they see a non-native species planted. In a place this diverse, it can be overwhelming to figure out how to come up with language that works with multiple values. And there are other challenges that can prevent this too. Urban biodiversity work is often deprioritized in comparison to other public goods, and evocative language is often used to elevate awareness of invasive species or generate the necessary funding to take care of some of these landscapes. Amid these challenges, New York City Parks Division of Environment Planning, a division about 240 staff, which range from foresters, ecologists, communication specialists, community engagement specialists, volunteer coordinators, data analysis, lots of people. This division wanted to move towards better language and framing for invasive species. For a while, staff had many informal discussions about issues with common communications of parks management work. And in 2022, this division had identified and solidified 4 core values, which you can see on the slide. One of which, be respectful and inclusive, was key. It soon became clear that inconsistencies existed between these core values and how division staff talked about invasive species, both externally and internally. And so over the next 2 years, several meetings were held to discuss these issues and ways forward, including 2 division-wide meetings held 6 months apart to start some of the discussions and to allow some time for people to think and digest. We also did an anonymous survey, a focus group of volunteer coordinators and restoration practitioners, and an invasive species communication working group. During this time, staff were able to experiment with different suggested words, and staff that engaged frequently with volunteers were able to come back to the working group after testing some of the words and offer feedback on what worked, what didn't work, where we were still missing things. Discussions and resources shared with other divisions, like our marketing division, led to a shift in another agency-wide guide, and this happened fairly recently. So our marketing team has a tool called the Voice and Tone Guidelines, which guide public both one-way, mostly written, and two-way communications, which are in person or through a dialogue by staff. And I'll reiterate, this is mainly for public communications, but they also guide our internal communications, just because that's the way sometimes the human brain works. The motivation for these particular additions is to help park staff become aware of and use language sensitive to New York City's social context, and to not use jargon that assumes technical familiarity, nor use language that may introduce or reinforce unintentional biases. The guidelines recommend, and I'm just going to read these here, to 1, minimize describing a species as non-native, to use the term native with care and offer additional explanation when you do, avoid using the word invasive in public communications, avoid language that suggests a species wants to hurt us, and where possible, remove place of origin and offensive words from common names. We've had lots of discussion about that today. These guidelines were developed and reviewed by the working groups mentioned earlier, and even the review process has started helping staff consider language more carefully. One reviewer mentioned the word introduced doesn't quite describe insects that hitchhiked, which led us to use Tim's study, and the suggestion of hitchhiker was added to describe invertebrates. Educators who reviewed the document mentioned to me that they were really excited about number 4, and that it was particularly helpful for helping them craft better language around species. So as these guidelines get used more widely, we're also hoping to learn from staff what has worked, what hasn't, and what needs to be adjusted. Okay, now I'm going to move on to my second case study, Just Language. So Just Language is a collective that began when 2 environmental educators, Danielle and Chris, pictured here, connected in a Facebook group in 2020 around their desire to reimagine how to convey the importance of invasion biology without ostracizing learners and how to reduce harm when doing so. They began by conducting a literature review over a few months, and they learned after this that while the issue had been heavily debated in literature, there was really no accessible resources to discuss these issues, build relationships and understandings, or develop language that aligned with their inclusive values. So in early 2021, the founders held their first Just Language public event that attracted about 100 attendees who had been recruited through their own networks and word of mouth. The event centered around cycles of inquiry and making accessible the literature review they'd conducted. They held another discussion a few months later, and over time, this effort grew. And now the group consists of about 11 steering committee members, including myself, which is why I'm presenting on both of these case studies. The members' backgrounds range from noxious weed specialists and plant ecologists to environmental educators, herbalists, and artists. This steering committee meets monthly to plan events, discuss recent learnings, and share podcasts, articles, art, and more. Since the first event in 2021, Just Language has put together 4 virtual public events, and members have had many more workshops at conferences, nonprofits, agencies, including my own agency and Seattle Parks Department. The presentations have more recently focused on uncovering the origins of invasion biology and how that has and how some of those early texts influenced dominant language and framing today. The members of Just Language see this effort as a community to connect with people who are lifelong learners committed to intentional language use. Just Language creates and holds spaces for these conversations and is working together and to design and provide free resources for better language use. Just Language's values that are listed here were codified in the last year after many conversations. And we found that though many of us had different values regarding nature, we could come together with these shared values and work together to find alternative ways of communicating in our respective contexts. And here are some examples of the products that Just Language is working on. The first is an alternative language guide that gives people options on words to choose from that could help communicate in their specific contexts and audiences. We recently held a virtual event to receive feedback from people who have attended our events in the past and are now working to incorporate that feedback. Another resource is a conversation guide, which is a tool to provide deeper context for while we're wanting to shift our language around these topics. And if you're interested in being on the distribution list for Just Language offering and resources, I'm hoping that somebody will drop the form link in the chat, or I'll share it a little bit later. And on a personal note, my participation in this group has helped me connect and build relationships with people who are thinking deeply about alternatives to dominant invasive species communications outside of my own context in New York City parks. And it's this kind of cross-pollination that's really helped to bring new ideas to the efforts at New York City parks, which we feel hasn't had much precedent. And it's been a great professional development opportunity on how to collaborate across differences towards shared goals. So through the work within both New York City parks and Just Language, we have a few shared lessons learned. First, both spaces had existing values of inclusiveness. I know some folks who want to change language within an organization without these enabling conditions may find it a little more difficult to bring up the fact that people may have different values regarding nature. We also realized how necessary it was to have ample time and space to discuss divergent values and value interpretations. Sometimes we may think we have similar values, but our interpretations of those values may be a little different. Just Language had monthly meetings and multiple public events, and New York City Parks created multiple spaces to discuss and share thoughts and emotions related to invasive species. We also felt it useful to allow time to sit and digest these ideas. Specific species or contexts were also helpful to build a container to think through options for language and framing. For example, the spotted lanternfly, which was mentioned already, was found in New York City in 2019, became a very visible example of a species that everybody knew about and that had lots of militaristic advertisements. And it helped to garner support for one of the efforts within our division, which was to create a long guide collecting current research and evidence around spotted lanternfly and create examples of ways to discuss this insect and its impacts without using militaristic and nativist framings. This guide was used to update the park's webpage on this species, which I'm also hoping somebody will drop in the chat. For New York City Parks and some members of Just Language, biodiversity maintenance has been a really useful framing because it's one of the main reasons that parks manages invasive species and focuses on invasive species management. By uplifting what we're working towards, which is biodiversity, communicators are able to also celebrate the cultural diversity of the city. And lastly, the examples and the guidance that we provided here may not work for everybody. For example, the voice and tone guidelines were developed with New York City social and ecological context in mind. And even so, it was mainly developed with New York City Park staff as opposed to co-created with intended audiences. Co-creation is a best practice that New York City Parks hasn't had the capacity for yet. We've applied for funding, but have just not gotten it yet. Just Language has intentionally framed their resources to offer multiple options for people so that they can choose things that work for their specific context and audiences, as opposed to being prescriptive. This has all been a huge learning journey for myself, for my colleagues, my co-authors, and our organizations, and we're still learning. And so looking forward to having more discussions with the folks that are participants in this workshop. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time and attention. My contact is here, as well as a contact for Just Language.
Thanks, Neha. And we're rounding out our presentations today. I think shifting kind of gears a little bit. And as everyone here in the room is thinking about the work that we're all going to be doing tomorrow, trying to synthesize this information and develop a roadmap for what we need moving forward and where we would like to go. Virginia Rhodes with the ARC Network is going to share a process that she has worked with through the summary of the ARC Network Problematic Jargon and STEM Workshop. And it's a process that we're going to be using here tomorrow to try to do something pretty similar. So this will give you all a feel for what we'll be up to tomorrow. So I'll hand it over to you, Virginia.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to speak to everyone today. So as Tim said, I'll be speaking on a summary of an ARC Network workshop on problematic jargon and STEM. First, a little bit of background. So the ARC Network is a grant initiative funded by the National Science Foundation. It stands for the Advanced Resource and Coordination Network. And we aim to connect researchers, practitioners, and other change agents working to advance equity in STEM into a larger community to drive change. We work to remove barriers to resources, advance research on intersectional gender equity issues, and reduce duplication of efforts. It's through a cooperative agreement between the Women in Engineering Proactive Network and the NSF Advanced Program. Our funding began in 2017 and it's been extended through 2025. We have a membership of around 2,500 individuals, and we also have our resource library where we house the WePan Knowledge Center and around 9,000 curated entries on resources relevant to justice and equity in STEM. I'd also like to tell you about our mission. So the ARC Network strives to enable authentic, intentional dialogue between researchers and practitioners, connect inclusiveness to organizational principles and practices, and account and incorporate intersectional perspectives throughout our work. And this 3 I's framework, I hope you'll be able to see throughout this presentation, is really what we're hoping to achieve. So the ARC Network has 2 research goals. The first is to recruit, fund, and oversee virtual visiting scholars. And the next is to facilitate these emerging research workshops, ERWs, which this presentation will focus on. So our research advisory board identifies themes for these emerging research workshops as primary areas in need of further research exploration and/or intervention in STEM. And they decide these themes based on recent scholarship, interests of the community, and current events. And so I'll be speaking more specifically about our 2022 workshop on problematic jargon. But before that, just a quick idea of what these workshops are. So these are 2-day in-person workshops where we engage participants in facilitated discussions on current research and practice, identify areas of synergy and unanswered questions, and then prioritize where additional or new research policy and/or intervention are needed. We have a planning committee composed of scholars and practitioners who do work in the respective research area, who help develop this workshop agenda, identify background materials, and curate a list of potential invitees. And then we nominate these scholars working in the respective topic area who represent a diverse array of disciplines, research, specialties, institution types, career stages, and social demographic backgrounds. And each workshop has about 20 to 25 of these scholars who participate. At the conclusion of the workshop, we come up with a concept paper comprised of everything that was discussed. And this is then given back to the participants and then later to the ARC Network community for feedback before we publish it to the broader STEM community, which includes researchers, administrators, change makers, so forth. So as I said, we'll be talking about the problematic jargon in STEM workshop, which actually the title change is Cultivating Equity in STEM Through Inclusive Language, because this actually better reflected the goals of the workshop overall and the findings that the work that participants thought of throughout this workshop. So I have the 2 goals of the workshop there, which was to strengthen participants' understanding about the use and impact of non-inclusive STEM language, and then also to identify new and emerging research themes and interventions in the area of incorporating inclusive language in STEM. So this was the workshop process, and you might notice that it's very similar to the process we'll be following tomorrow. And that's because Elle was actually an attendee at this workshop. So thank you for being there, and thank you for inviting me to share on our work. I'll be focusing specifically on the series of discussion questions that were talked about during day 1. And then I will walk you through the resulting priority research areas or interventions that were identified by the participants for greater in-depth exploration. A quick note, I don't really need to say much on why this theme. I think many of you are aware that language and terminology are integral parts of STEM culture and often reflect larger social structures and power dynamics. The language, rhetoric, metaphors, and key terminology within STEM fields help shape accessibility and inclusion in those fields, as well as research approaches and solutions. So, for example, the commonly used terminology of master-slave to refer to primary and secondary parts, and male and female to refer to mating connectors reflect problematic metaphors steeped in white supremacy, as well as sexism and heteronormative. So this workshop was put together to answer this bigger question of what are the key areas of research and intervention needed to incorporate inclusive language and STEM. And to answer this question, participants were engaged in small group discussions on a series of 4 guiding questions. And I'll walk through these questions and what participants had to say for each one. The first is, what do we know about the effects of problematic jargon in STEM? So first, we know that words matter, especially in healthcare where metaphors are essential to patient understanding. So an example is, we know that patients who are told cancer is a challenge rather than an obstacle, or worse, punishment, have better outcomes. In other cases, the choice of words can discourage individuals from seeking treatment. So for example, patients with sickle cell anemia are sometimes called sicklers by physicians who often treat them as difficult and ignorant about their own bodies, and this can discourage them from seeking treatment in the first place. The usage of metaphor also places restrictions on how researchers think about problems. For example, using the term invasive species implies agency on the part of pests. However, they're often not invaders, but rather opportunists taking advantage of these niches created by human disturbance. Furthermore, when a metaphor becomes entrenched, it can reinforce these societal paradigms in the case of militarism and xenophobia, as some of the other presenters mentioned. Lastly, using language that evokes power, so war, frontier, individualism, can also discourage engagement by those who don't accept those structures of power. So non-inclusive language really limits who's attracted to a particular field, and students in particular may not be attracted to fields that use those alienating languages or metaphors. Also, the collaborative nature of science is best achieved when we have these multiple perspectives engaged, and using non-inclusive language limits the community that's engaged in this work. And so we need to change that. The second question is what might be done and by whom to eliminate the use of non-inclusive language and to intentionally use inclusive language. So educators, present and future, really need critical training on the use of language, and students should also be encouraged to share their experiences. Embedding these training and listening into STEM curricula is necessary to avoid it being perceived as more of a nicety or just being politically correct. We also need to engage with professional societies, funding agencies, authors. Specifically, professional societies and accreditation bodies have a key role in encouraging this more humanistic and social science perspective. Similarly, funding agencies must be alerted to this problem, and participants mentioned including consideration of inclusive language in funding agency criteria. Also, highlighting this issue within and across disciplines is also important. So while one discipline may use a problematic term, there are similarities across disciplines that can make the problem more visible. So that master-slave metaphor is used in computer science, engineering, photography, entomology, other fields. So having those cross-discipline collaborations can show that this isn't just a problem for one discipline, it's across many. And lastly, STEM communication in public spaces has a role to play as well. So recent pieces in the media, such as that change to Spongy Moth, have really cast a spotlight on the problem and helped generate conversation across disciplines. Our next question was, what are the possibilities for interdisciplinary collaboration on the issue of problematic jargon in STEM? So you might be seeing a theme here. Collaboration across disciplines is essential. So scientists and engineers who are generally not trained to study language and power structures need to be talking to those who are studying it and making those connections. Again, funding agencies can also highlight this issue and require multidisciplinary teams to tackle it. So for example, the NSF Broader Impacts language might include specific reference to non-inclusive language. Participants also noted that compiling dictionaries of scientific metaphor and histories of jargon change would also be very helpful. There's a lot of changes going on, and having a compilation would be helpful in thinking about what terms we should be using in the future. And lastly, utilizing other methods of communication. So the arts can contribute to this conversation as well. The field of graphic medicine, for example, uses comic book techniques to explore issues in healthcare. And this is a different mode of communication that may work better for folks. And our last discussion question was, what will be most impactful in persuading colleagues to eliminate the use of non-inclusive language and intentionally use inclusive language? So I think it's important to note that some people will not need to be persuaded at all, and others will be unpersuadable. And we should be focusing on those middle ground folks, particularly their values. If inclusivity, for example, is a value for them, then language needs to be as much a part of the conversation as unconscious bias has become. We should also look to professional societies, journals, and again, funding agencies as researchers and practitioners also look to those different groups and the actions of those groups. As the slide says, we need both top-down and bottom-up approaches with support given to those who are advocating for change. And then lastly, there's additional avenues that we can look towards. So textbooks can alter pedagogy, especially when those larger institutions adopt them. IRBs can also play a role because they include non-specialists and members of the public. So problematic language may be flagged that otherwise is overlooked. And lastly, healthcare practitioners focus on outcomes. So tying language use to health outcomes is essential. So from those discussion questions, participants showed a strong interest in further developing these 5 priority research areas that I will quickly walk through here. The first is understanding the social implications of language use on inclusion and marginalization in STEM. So given that ours was one of the first workshops on the topic of problematic terms, there's this need for foundational work. We need to answer questions such as who is being marginalized and how is our language contributing to it? How does STEM language reinforce this marginalization? What are the areas that have been changed successfully and what hasn't been successful? Things like that. And to develop such a foundation for future work, we also need to use a variety of methods. So focus groups, historical analysis, surveys, text mining, etc. And a multidisciplinary approach is essential to identify the most important pathways for future research. The second area is a meta-historical compilation of previous name changes across discipline. This historical analysis of changes can identify compelling arguments and factors and parties that help to affect change, as well as the resistance to change and the timelines of what that change might have looked like. Just as important, we also need to analyze terminology that were not successful in having changes and why that was the case. Again, research requires multiple perspectives and methodologies, and we encourage these new collaborations among those who are trained in social and language analysis and other STEM researchers, practitioners, and educators. Our third area here was persuasion strategies for convincing scientists to change their usage. So we need to ask the question, what causes scientists to question and possibly change accepted usage? What are the points of resistance to change? And then how can we counter them? And this concept of resistance has two sides. So there are those who resist the current usage and those who resist proposed change. And we must understand both groups and what motivates those who propose change and what arguments are most likely to persuade others that change is needed. If our goal to change language use is to be successful, we must also understand how scientists think about social issues within their disciplines. And layered strategies may be useful in doing this. So senior or more established scientists may not be receptive to calls for change, but their students may be. Those working in research-intensive institutions who generate much of the literature that uses problematic jargon may be early adopters of change as well as resistors, whereas those working in teaching-intensive institutions have less power to change terminology, but may be more instrumental in identifying and documenting the harm done by such terms. And again, pursuing these agendas will require collaboration between social scientists, humanists, agents of change in the scientific discipline itself. And it's likely that different branches of STEM will require different approaches as well. Our fourth area was anti-racism and anti-oppression curricular development. So this topic acknowledges that non-inclusive language is not a standalone problem. It's embedded in and reflects structural inequities, including racism, sexism, ableism, historical gender roles, and the like. And a holistic remedy must involve challenging those structural inequities. We need to dissect power structures and the associated allocation of privilege. Anti-oppression movements must also include students and educators, community members, and those who are in power. Multiple disciplines need to weigh in, from the arts and humanities through to medicine, engineering, and so on. And that's acknowledgement and analysis of structural oppression needs to pervade every discipline in the classroom and in workplaces as well. And lastly, the issue of community respect for education, especially public education, is complex, and regaining public trust and retaining public trust will require honest and persistent communication about educational ideals, historical patterns of oppression, and structural barriers to equity. And our last priority area that participants identify was the role of professional societies to affect culture change. Professional societies are often the gatekeepers of culture within their respective disciplines, and scientific and engineering societies in particular can influence thinking among their members concerning inclusive practices. The broad membership of societies as well, from researchers, educators, those in academia, government, so on, also gives professional societies leverage for achieving structural change. This last point is talking about professional societies that are formed to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, have a special role to play. So those that serve historically marginalized groups share the goal of inclusivity and a coalition of these societies that focuses on language use could be especially powerful. In particular, they can work with and highlight more grassroots efforts among their members to suggest language changes that promote inclusivity. So going on to final thoughts here. While our workshop has ended, we hope the conversation around this topic continue and that more workshops, such as the one we're attending now and tomorrow, are created to continue this conversation. And I look forward to seeing everyone in person tomorrow to further the discussion on inclusive language. I would also encourage you to explore the emerging research workshop reports, this one and our other ones that go into further detail on what I've discussed today, and include other avenues of research that may be of interest to you. And lastly, if you're interested in learning more about how faculty and practitioners are improving equity in STEM, I'd highly recommend you become a member of the ARC network or attend our Advanced Equity in STEM community convening in Baltimore in June. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Virginia. We did it. We made it. I think we blew through question time, but we have all been busy here in the room answering questions. It doesn't look like there are any additional open questions. And given the time, I think we'll wrap up for today. So first, I just want to thank NAISMA for hosting us and helping us put on this webinar. Wouldn't have been able to do it without your help, and thank you for having it go smoothly. And then thank you to all of our presenters for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. I know we all learned a lot, and we look forward to applying what we learned today, tomorrow. And for everyone that joined us, thank you so much. We hope you learned something. My one ask of you is that you fill out the evaluation that is in the chat, or when you get the email follow-up, fill it out then. And if you have any thoughts or ideas that you'd like for the in-person group to consider, you can either put that in the evaluation survey or just send one of us an email. And we'd be happy to try to incorporate that into what we're doing tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. And we hope that we see you all again soon.
And here's just a QR code for that survey for anyone as you're signing off. But thank you so much for joining us.